Welcome, weary traveler, to the forgotten corners of a dying world. Tonight, we walk together through painted sanctuaries and buried kingdoms, through the memories of fallen knights and the dreams of those who refuse to let go. These are stories of the dark souls, tales whispered in the spaces between bonfires, where ash meets darkness and everything eventually fades. So settle in, let your breath slow, and allow these legends of sacrifice and inevitable decay to carry you gently toward rest. There is no need to remember every detail. Just let the darkness embrace you, as it embraces all things in the end. In the beginning, there was canvas and blood, and from these humble materials, entire worlds were born. The painted worlds have existed since time immemorial, refuges created for those who have no place in the waking realm, sanctuaries for souls so broken or so dangerous that reality itself cannot contain them. They are beautiful in their melancholy, these false heavens built from pigment and longing, and they serve a purpose that the gods themselves have recognized as necessary across the turning of countless ages. To understand the painted world of Ariandel, one must first understand what it means to be forlorn. This is not simple sadness or ordinary grief, though both of these emotions certainly play their part in the tapestry of sorrow that defines these places. To be forlorn is to exist in a state of profound abandonment, to carry within oneself a story so tragic or so terrible that the world outside cannot bear to look upon it, cannot find space to accommodate the weight of such concentrated despair. The painted worlds draw these souls to themselves like moths to flame, or perhaps more accurately, like pilgrims to a shrine they did not know they were seeking. The mechanism of this attraction remains mysterious, even to scholars who have devoted lifetimes to its study. But the effect is undeniable. Those who belong in the painting find their way there, pulled by invisible threads of fate or sympathy or simple gravitational truth, the way water finds its level and stones fall toward the earth. Ariandel itself is a landscape of contradictions that somehow achieve harmony in their opposition. It is cold, bitterly so, with snow that falls in endless curtains of white and winds that cut through armor and flesh with equal indifference. Yet there is also rot here, a sweetness of decay that pervades everything, turning the snow grey in places and filling the air with the scent of things slowly dissolving back into their component elements. It is, as one of its inhabitants describes it, a sweetly rotting bed to lie upon, a place where one can finally stop struggling and simply accept the inevitable transformation that awaits all living things. The world is gentler than the reality beyond its borders, for all its cold and corruption. Here, at least, there is acceptance of what one has become, acknowledgement of the stories that brought each soul to this place of exile. Here, the forlorn can cease their endless running from memories and consequences, can lay down their burdens in the snow, and simply exist without judgment or expectation. Among the first inhabitants one encounters in this strange realm are the followers of Pharaon, and their presence speaks volumes about the nature of this refuge and who it shelters. These warriors wear pointed steel helms that mark them unmistakably as members of the undead legion of Pharaon, or at least as inheritors of that proud and tragic tradition. Their armor is worn but well maintained, their weapons still sharp despite the countless battles they have survived, and in their movements one can still see echoes of the discipline and coordination that once made the Legion a force capable of standing against the abyss itself. But Pharaon has fallen. This is a truth that hangs over these warriors like a shroud, coloring every action and every moment of their continued existence. The keep where they once trained and prepared for battle against the darkness has been consumed by poison and decay, its halls prowled by corrupted versions of their own brethren, its purpose perverted beyond all recognition. The Abyss Watchers, Those legendary warriors who had dedicated themselves to containing the spread of the abyss were themselves consumed by the very darkness they sought to combat, locked in eternal battle with one another as the corruption they had absorbed drove them to madness. The followers survived this catastrophe, but survival came at a cost that perhaps exceeded death. They watched their home fall to ruin, watched their comrades transform into hollow mockeries of what they had once been, watched everything they had dedicated their lives to protecting crumble into poisoned swamp and corrupted stone. With nowhere left to go and nothing left to fight for, with their purpose stripped away and their brotherhood shattered, they found themselves drawn into the painted world, pulled by the same invisible force that gathers all the forlorn and unwanted. Here in Ariandel they continue their endless patrol, guarding what exactly? There are no more abyss incursions to contain in this false world. No more innocent villages to protect from the spreading darkness. Yet they maintain their formations, execute their practiced movements, stand watch over territories that have no strategic value whatsoever. Perhaps this is all they know how to do, the only way they can conceive of existing. Or perhaps there is comfort in the familiar rhythms of duty, even when that duty has lost all larger meaning. The Millwood Knights represent another flavor of tragedy, though their story follows a similar arc of loss and displacement. These warriors are said to have fought hand in hand with the earth itself, their combat style incorporating the very terrain around them as both weapon and ally. Their massive great bows and equally impressive great arrows speak of a people who understood the importance of range and positioning, who could strike from distances that rendered retaliation impossible. Long ago, when the world was younger and more forgiving, the Millwood Knights had a forest they called home. The texts do not specify which forest this was, or where it might have been located in the geography of the waking world, but this ambiguity only adds to the mythic quality of their tale. It was their forest, and that is all that matters. A place where the trees knew them, and the earth rose to meet their feet, where they belonged in the most fundamental sense of that word. Then they lost it. Again, the specifics are frustratingly vague, hidden behind the mists of time and the fragmentary nature of the records that survive. Perhaps their forest was burned, or flooded, or simply claimed by some rival power with greater numbers or superior tactics. Perhaps it was consumed by the same spreading corruption that has claimed so many other places across the long decline of this dying world. The cause matters less than the effect. The Millwood Knights became wanderers, exiles from the only home they had ever known. Their journey was so long that even thoughts of their sworn enemy washed away like drawings in sand gradually erased by wind and time. This detail is particularly poignant, speaking to the way extended suffering can hollow out even the strongest convictions and most passionate hatreds. Whoever their enemy had been, whatever rival kingdom or monster or force of nature they had dedicated themselves to opposing, eventually ceased to matter as the years of wandering stretched into decades and then into something approaching forever. What replaced their defining hatred was something stranger and perhaps more terrible in its own way, a vision of a cold and brittle wood. Not a memory, for they had left their forest behind and could never return to it. Not quite a hallucination, though it occupied their minds with the persistence and clarity of something seen with physical eyes. This vision drew them forward like a lodestone, promising something that might approximate the home they had lost. And eventually, it drew them into the painted world where that vision could be made manifest, or at least where they could exist in a place that resonated with the images that haunted their dreams. The tower where one finds the captain's ashes is both monument and tomb, a place where the story of the Millwood Knights can be pieced together from the fragments they left behind. The climb to reach these ashes is an ordeal in itself, a vertical journey through enemy territory while arrows rain down from above, each shaft fired by warriors who retain enough of their former skill to make every shot a potential death sentence. The frustration of this ascent mirrors something of what the knights themselves must have felt during their long journey, the sense of struggling toward a goal that may not even exist, of enduring punishment for crimes uncommitted, of finding that even a rival brings no real peace. When one finally reaches the top and claims the ashes, there is a moment of quiet understanding. These knights came so far, lost so much, sought so desperately for something to replace what had been taken from them, and in the end, they found only this: a cold painted world that could approximate but never truly replicate the forest they had loved, a place where they could stop running but never truly rest. The Corvians represent perhaps the most visible manifestation of the painted world's central conflict, the tension between fire and rot that defines every aspect of existence in this strange realm. These crow-like creatures are markedly different from other Corvian species that might be encountered elsewhere in the world, and the differences speak to the specific nature of Ariandel's curse. The common Corvians of Ariandel are pitiful things, barely worthy of the name warrior or even creature. They drag themselves through the snow with movements that suggest profound suffering, their bodies twisted and malformed by some terrible affliction that they carry with them like a physical burden. Their feathers are matted and discolored, their movements uncertain and pained, their attacks so weak and poorly coordinated that they present almost no threat to anyone with even basic combat training. This easy gameplay sequence is deliberate, a moment of mechanical respite that serves narrative purpose as much as it provides breathing room between more challenging encounters. The weakness of these Corvians is meant to inspire not triumph but pity, to make the player understand viscerally that these creatures are victims rather than villains, that their current state represents degradation from something that once possessed dignity and purpose. Further along the snow-covered paths, one encounters the source of this degradation, or at least one manifestation of it. The Corvian knights are everything their lesser brethren are not: powerful, aggressive, deadly in their precision, and relentless in their assault. Their body structure and characteristic pecking attack recall the crows of Velka from ages past, those servants of the goddess of sin who dispensed punishment with beaks that could pierce armor and talons that could rend flesh from bone. But the Corvian knights have made a choice that sets them apart from their goddess's original servants, a decision that created the schism now visible in the degraded state of their brethren. These knights became infatuated with Sister Friede, the woman who rules the painted world from the chapel of Ariandel. Like her, they embraced the rot that spreads through this realm, choosing to see decay not as a problem to be solved, but as a natural state to be accepted and even protected. This decision led them to make war upon their own people. The weapons found scattered on the rooftops tell this story in their item descriptions, speaking of how the Corvian knights swore to protect the painting from fire and executed those among their brethren who held different ideas about the proper fate of their world. This was not a brief conflict or a minor disagreement, but a systematic purge, a civil war among the Corvians that resulted in some being elevated to the status of enforcers, while others were reduced to the crawling, pitiful things one encounters in the snow. The voices of the survivors make clear what was at stake in this conflict. "Oh, wondrous ash," one of them pleads, using the title given to those unkindled warriors who have returned from death to fulfill some greater purpose. "Grant us our wish. Make the tales true, and burn this world away." The desperation in these words is palpable, even through the formal language of their delivery. These Corvians have seen the rot that afflicts their world, have understood that their painted sanctuary has become a prison, and have concluded that only fire can cleanse what has become too corrupted to save. Surely you've seen the rot that afflicts our world, the Corvian continues, and indeed, it is impossible to miss. The sweet smell of decay permeates everything, and pools of corruption bubble and steam in places where the snow has melted away. But that which fooled the good father and buried the flame. Here is the heart of the tragedy. There was once a flame here, a source of cleansing fire that could have burned away the rot and allowed the painted world to be reborn into something new. But Fride convinced Father Ariandel to suppress that flame, to embrace the rot instead. And the Corvian knights enforced this decision with brutal efficiency, after we had all made up our minds too, the Corvian adds. And this detail is particularly heartbreaking. It suggests that at some point, perhaps long ago, there was consensus among the inhabitants of Ariandel. They had looked upon their rotting world, had understood what needed to be done, had made the difficult choice to accept their own destruction in the service of necessary transformation. But then Fride arrived and changed everything, swaying Father Ariandel to her vision of eternal preservation. And those who had accepted fire found themselves branded as traitors and heretics in their own home. The plea continues. So please, grant us one wish. My lady must see flame, and you have only to show her. This lady refers to someone not yet encountered, someone whose sight of flame carries significance that transcends simple observation. The prophecy that hangs over Ariandel speaks of two ashes who will burn the painted world away, returning it to canvas so that something new might be painted in its place. If Fride and the Corvian knights represent those who would preserve the world in its current state of decay, then the player character represents the fulfillment of this prophecy, the second ash who heralds the return of flame. At the bridge leading to the chapel of Ariandel, one encounters Sir Wilhelm, a knight whose loyalty to Frida defines every aspect of his existence. He is dressed in black armor that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his manner is formal to the point of archaic, speaking in thee and thou like a character from a much older story. If you've lost your way, he suggests with barely concealed condescension, the words of Lady Fride will guide you. Now go on inside, show respect, and listen carefully. His dialogue reveals much about the dynamic within the chapel and the painted world more broadly. He refers to visitors as meek and faded things, suggesting he views the inhabitants and newcomers to Ariandel as inferior beings deserving of pity more than respect. His insistence that visitors return to whence they came, that they have a place in the outside world, and that alone is cause to rejoice, speaks to a kind of gatekeeping mentality, a belief that the painted world should remain closed to all but the truly forlorn. The ring he gives contains its own story in its description. This ring was never meant to grace Frida's hand, for the painting and its frost became her home, her chosen refuge. The implication is that Wilhelm brought this ring intending it for someone else, or perhaps intending to give it to Frida as a gift or token, only to discover that she had already committed herself so completely to Ariandel that such gestures were rendered meaningless. There is one thing you should know, Wilhelm warns before allowing passage. Inside the cold painting, curiosity could be your cross. Stray from the withering flame, and the snow will swallow you whole. This is both practical advice and veiled threat, a warning that those who seek too deeply into Ariandel's secrets may find themselves consumed by the very forces that make this place a refuge for the forlorn. Within the snow and beyond the immediate vicinity of the chapel, the full ecology of Ariandel's corruption becomes visible. The crawling Corvians are everywhere, dragging their malformed bodies through drifts that threaten to bury them completely. The contrast between these pitiful creatures and the Corvian knights who patrol certain key areas could not be more stark, and it serves as constant reminder of what it means to resist the will of those in power, even when that will leads only to deeper rot and more profound decay. The Corvian knights themselves are formidable opponents. Their attacks swift and brutal, their range deceptive, their ability to close distance alarming. They fight with the same pecking motions that characterize the crows of Velka, but amplified through size and strength until what might once have been merely painful becomes potentially lethal. Their dedication to Friday and to the preservation of the rotting world has made them into perfect enforcers, warriors who will tolerate no challenge to the status quo they have chosen to protect. Sister Friday herself awaits within the chapel of Ariandel, and her appearance is striking in its simplicity and elegance. She is dressed in white robes that seem untouched by the rot that afflicts everything around her. Her hair equally white and flowing, her manner polite and refined in ways that recall the nobility of a much earlier age. She speaks softly, addresses visitors with courtesy, and carries herself with the poise of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But beneath this veneer of gentility lies something far more complex and considerably darker. Friday is revealed through various item descriptions and contextual clues to be Elfriede, the eldest of the three sisters who founded the Sable Church of Londor. Before entering the painted world, she was a figure of considerable power and influence in the politics of that dark kingdom, a leader whose word carried weight and whose decisions shaped the course of entire movements. The Sable Church itself is an organization built around the concept of hollowing as a state to be embraced rather than feared or cured, where most of the world views the hollow curse as a tragedy, a degradation of humanity into mindless undeath. The Church teaches that hollowing represents a kind of transcendence, a shedding of the limitations and weaknesses of flesh, in favor of something purer and more enduring. This philosophy has attracted many followers over the years, particularly among those who have suffered greatly and who seek meaning in their seemingly endless existence. Liliane was the youngest of the three sisters, the first to speak many of the miracles that would become central to the Church's practice. Her youth gave her the role of voice and messenger, the one who could articulate visions and experiences that the others might have struggled to express. Yuria was the second eldest, and she serves as the player's guide in the base game of Dark Souls 3 for those who pursue the path to becoming a Lord of Hollows. Her role combines practical instruction with spiritual guidance, helping unkindled warriors understand what it means to embrace rather than resist their nature. But Elfriede was the eldest, and in many traditions, the eldest carries the heaviest burdens and the greatest responsibilities. Wilhelm, the Black Knight who guards the approach to the chapel, was particularly loyal to this eldest sister, his devotion transcending simple duty to become something approaching religious fervor. His presence here in the painted world, so far from Londor and the church they both once served, speaks to the depth of his commitment and the profound nature of whatever drove Elfriede to renounce her former life, for she did renounce it. The item descriptions make this clear, explaining that Elfriede left behind her position and authority, abandoned her sisters and the church they had built together, and entered the painted world, seeking something she could not find in the waking realm. What she discovered here was a people she wished to protect, inhabitants of Ariandel, who resonated with something deep within her own soul, and she made the choice to become what they needed her to be. She assumed, the texts tell us, the precise form that they yearned for. In practical terms, this meant becoming a polite, scythe-wielding lady of the painting, a figure who recalled crossbreed Priscilla, the original keeper of the first painted world. Priscilla was a half-dragon, a being of mixed heritage who was considered too dangerous and too strange to exist in the outside world, and she had ruled her painted domain with gentle firmness for ages beyond counting. By taking on Priscilla's role and mannerisms, Fride positioned herself as a legitimate successor to that ancient guardian, someone who could provide the protection and structure that the forlorn inhabitants of Ariandel desperately needed. But Fride is not Priscilla. She is unkindled ash, one of those warriors who failed to link the fire in their own time and were burned to cinders for their inadequacy, only to be resurrected later when the world grew desperate enough to accept even failed champions. As unkindled, she should seek flame, should work toward the linking of the fire, or at least toward the completion of whatever task she was resurrected to fulfill. Instead, she has chosen rot over fire, preservation over transformation, and she has convinced Father Ariandel to make that same choice. Father Ariandel himself is a figure shrouded in mystery and suffering. He is said to have restored the painting of Ariandel after some previous catastrophe, though the details of this restoration remain frustratingly vague. What is clear is that he possesses some deep connection to the painted world itself, some ability to influence its fundamental nature that goes beyond simple habitation or governance. When he chose to embrace rot alongside Freed, when he decided to suppress the flame that should have cleansed and renewed the world, he took upon himself the burden of maintaining that decision through constant sacrifice. In order to suppress the flame, Father Ariandel shreds his own skin with a many-tailed flail, opening wounds that never fully heal, and pouring his blood out in a crimson offering that somehow keeps the flame at bay. This is not metaphorical sacrifice, but literal, physical, agonizing self-mutilation performed continuously across what must be years or decades, or perhaps even longer. The painting, he and Frida believe, was painted with blood, and only blood can protect the sacred. Whether this belief is factually accurate, or merely a justification for the path they have chosen, it has become the foundation of their rule over Ariandel and the source of the rot that now consumes everything. The ringed city stands at the very edge of everything, the final destination, at the end of a world that has been ending for so long that the concept of conclusion has lost all meaning. To reach this place is to travel not merely through space but through time itself, moving forward into a future that has already happened, a tomorrow that became yesterday before anyone thought to mark the passage of days. This is where all things eventually arrive when they have nowhere left to go, when the great wheel of existence has turned so many times that the grooves have worn smooth and the mechanism begins to stutter and fail. The journey begins in a place called the Dreg Heap, and the name alone speaks volumes about what awaits those brave or foolish enough to venture here. A dreg is a remnant, a leftover, the sediment that settles at the bottom of a container after everything of value has been poured out and consumed. The Dreg Heap is exactly this, the accumulated sediment of reality itself, layers upon layers of kingdoms and castles, and entire ages collapsed upon themselves, like a house of cards built too high and too precariously to stand against the weight of its own ambition. Here, one can see Earthen Peak merged impossibly with Harvest Valley, two locations that existed in completely different places and times now occupying the same impossible space. The windmill that once turned lazily in desert heat now juts from a cliff face at an angle that defies all logic, its blades frozen in position as if time itself has given up trying to make sense of the physics involved. The poison pools that characterize both locations have merged and intensified, creating streams of toxic sludge that flow upward as often as down, following gravitational rules that belong to no single age or place. This is not merely architectural confusion, but the literal death of geography, the point at which the map of the world has been folded and crumpled so many times that all points now touch all other points, rendering navigation a matter of intuition rather than logic. One walks through corridors that were never meant to connect, climbs stairways that lead both up and down simultaneously, passes through doorways that open onto vistas from completely different kingdoms and eras. The descent through the dreg heap is relentlessly vertical, a long fall through layers of history that have compressed into a single suffocating mass. Each level represents not just a different location, but a different age of the world, and to move downward is to travel forward through time toward the final moment when everything stops. The architecture grows stranger the deeper one ventures, less coherent, more willing to abandon even the pretense of following the rules that once governed how buildings stood and how spaces related to one another. The inhabitants of this nightmare landscape are equally displaced and confused, hollow warriors from ages long past patrol battlements that no longer protect anything, their armor rusted and their movements mechanical, repeating patterns of behavior that once had purpose, but now exist only as meaningless ritual. The Lothric Knights, once proud defenders of a kingdom dedicated to linking the fire, now stumble through ruins that may or may not be the remains of their own home, unable to tell the difference between the place they swore to protect and the countless other places that have collapsed into this same terrible heap. But the most disturbing presence in the dreg heap comes from above rather than below. The angels of the Sable Church circle in the sky like vultures given divine form, their wings spread wide to reveal bodies that are anything but angelic in their proportions and appearance. These creatures are products of dark sorcery, experiments conducted by the Church of Londor in their attempts to understand and harness the power that lies within humanity's dark soul. The process that created them involved the implantation of what the texts call winged knights, or perhaps the essence of such knights, into living hosts, and the results are abominations that marry the holy with the horrific in ways that make the mind recoil. Their presence here in the dreg heap speaks to the reach and influence of the Sable Church, an organization that has existed in various forms across multiple ages of the world, always working toward the same goal, the establishment of an age of dark, to replace the current age of fire. The angels serve as both weapons and propaganda, demonstrating that humanity can create its own divinity, that the power of the dark soul can manifest in forms that rival or exceed the miracles of the gods who have ruled for so long. The light that streams from their bodies is beautiful in its intensity, golden and warm like sunlight filtering through stained glass, and this beauty makes their attacks all the more terrible. They fire barrages of light projectiles that track their targets with unnerving accuracy, each impact exploding with force sufficient to shatter stone and vaporize flesh. To be caught in the open when an angel begins its assault is to invite swift and inevitable death, and the only defense is to find cover and wait for the storm of light to pass, hoping that the structures providing shelter can withstand the onslaught. Among the displaced souls wandering the dreg heap is a figure who calls himself Lap, though even he seems uncertain whether this name truly belongs to him or is merely something he has adopted in the absence of genuine memory. He is dressed in mismatched armor that suggests both considerable experience in combat and complete disregard for appearances, and his manner is affable in ways that feel slightly forced, as though he is working very hard to project an image of harmlessness and good humor. Lap claims to be searching for something, though he cannot quite remember what that something might be. This is not an unusual condition in a world where so many have lost their memories along with everything else, where hollowing strips away not just the flesh but the very sense of self that makes identity possible. What makes Lap notable is his persistence in the face of this amnesia, his determination to keep searching, even when he cannot remember what he seeks or why it matters. His questline leads the player on a journey through some of the most dangerous areas of the Dreg Heap and eventually into the Ringed City itself, always with Lap appearing at crucial moments to offer assistance or request aid, his presence becoming familiar, even as his true nature remains obscure. There is something about him that suggests depth beneath the surface, secrets hidden behind the cheerful facade, and those who take the time to help him through his journey will eventually be rewarded with revelations that recontextualize everything that came before. The path from the Dreg Heap into the Ringed City proper requires passing through barriers that seem designed to prevent exactly this transition. Massive roots from the world tree Yggdrasil itself block certain passages, their wood harder than steel and impervious to even the most powerful weapons. Only by finding and activating certain mechanisms, by manipulating the environment in ways that demonstrate understanding of the larger structure, can one create openings sufficient to allow passage into the city that lies beyond and below. When the Ringed City finally reveals itself, the sight is both magnificent and deeply unsettling. This is not a ruin in the conventional sense, not a place that was built and then fell to decay through neglect or disaster. Rather, it is a city that exists in a state of perpetual contradiction, simultaneously pristine and corrupted, new and ancient, real and illusory. The architecture follows styles that predate even the Age of Fire, suggesting origins in the Age of Ancients when dragons ruled the world and humanity had not yet discovered the flame that would allow them to challenge that rule. The city was, according to the fragments of lore that can be pieced together, a gift from the gods to the pygmies who first discovered the Dark Soul. In the earliest days after Gwyn and his companions claimed the Lord's souls from the first flame and used that power to defeat the everlasting dragons, humanity emerged from the dark as a weak and seemingly insignificant race. But the furtive pygmy, that mysterious figure whose name and face have been deliberately obscured by history, found a soul of his own in the dying embers of the first flame, and this dark soul gave humanity potential that the gods found deeply troubling. Rather than destroying humanity outright, which might have proven impossible given the nature of the dark soul and its ability to fragment and reproduce, Gwyn made a different choice. He gave the pygmies a city of their own, a place where they could dwell separate from the kingdoms of the gods, and he ringed this city with a peculiar form of containment. The Ringed City was both gift and prison, a demonstration of divine magnanimity that was simultaneously an act of quarantine, keeping humanity's darkness contained in a place where it could not threaten the Age of Fire that Gwyn had worked so hard to establish. The seal of fire that surrounds and permeates the city has held for longer than anyone can calculate, maintained through mechanisms that combine divine power with pure force of will. This seal does more than simply prevent escape. It actively suppresses the dark soul's power, keeping humanity weak and manageable, ensuring that the Age of Dark that should naturally follow the Age of Fire can be indefinitely postponed. Every soul born within the Ringed City carries this seal upon them, a mark that is simultaneously badge and brand, proof of their heritage and evidence of their imprisonment. The Ring Knights patrol the city's streets and ramparts with movements that speak of eons of practice and dedication. These are humanity's first warriors, the original defenders who took up arms to protect their people, in an age when such protection seemed futile against enemies as vast and powerful as gods and dragons. Their armor is magnificent in its craftsmanship, each piece etched with designs that recall the Age of Ancients, while incorporating elements that speak to humanity's emerging identity as a race separate from both gods and dragons. But something terrible has happened to these knights over the countless ages of their vigil. Their armor has begun to melt into their flesh, the metal literally fusing with the bodies it was meant to protect, creating hybrid forms that are neither fully human nor entirely mechanical. This fusion is not the result of heat or accident, but rather a manifestation of the darkness that lives within them, the dark soul's power slowly corrupting and transforming everything it touches. The knights continue their patrol, continue to execute their duties with the same precision and dedication they showed when they first took up their posts. But they do so now as much monuments as warriors, living statues that guard a city which may no longer require or desire their protection. Their weapons tell their own story of decline and corruption. The massive greatswords and enormous shields that the ring knights carry were forged in ages past to be wielded with two hands, requiring the full strength and coordination of a trained warrior to use effectively. But over time, as the darkness within the knights grew stronger, their strength increased to inhuman levels while their technique deteriorated. Now they wield these massive weapons one-handed, swinging them with brute force that sacrifices all elegance and finesse in favor of raw, destructive power. They are stronger than they were, but they have lost something essential in gaining that strength, and their fighting style reflects this trade-off in every wild, powerful swing. The darkness that seeps from their forms is visible as a kind of oily smoke or liquid shadow, pooling around their feet and trailing behind them as they move. This is not merely aesthetic detail, but manifestation of the fundamental truth about humanity in the world of dark souls. That humans are creatures of dark rather than light. That the true nature of the human soul is aligned with the void that existed before the first flame rather than the fire that currently rules the world. The ring knights have spent so long in proximity to concentrated dark, have carried the dark soul's fragments within themselves for so many ages, that they have begun to literally exude the darkness that defines them. Deep within the city, in chambers that seem to exist partially outside normal space and time, lies one of the most tragic figures in all of Dark Souls lore. Dark Eater Midir was once an archdagon, one of those magnificent immortal creatures who sided with the gods during the war against the ancient dragons, and were elevated to positions of honor and responsibility as reward for their loyalty. Where most dragons are creatures of fire or lightning or other elemental forces, Midir's purpose was stranger and more specific. He was raised by the gods, specifically to combat the abyss, to serve as a living weapon against the darkness that constantly threatened to consume the world. His task was to protect the ringed city from the abyss that swirled around it, to devour the darkness before it could breach the walls and corrupt the inhabitants within. For centuries beyond counting, Midir performed this duty with absolute dedication and unfailing courage. He stationed himself in the depths below the city, in places where the abyss was strongest and most concentrated, and there he consumed the darkness day after day, year after year, age after age, swallowing down the corruption that would have destroyed everything he was charged to protect. But darkness is not like other foods, not something that can be digested and eliminated. The abyss that Midir consumed remained within him, accumulating in his body like a poison for which there is no antidote. Slowly, inevitably, the very darkness he had spent his life fighting began to change him from within. The dragon who had been humanity's protector found himself becoming the very thing he had sworn to destroy. His mind clouding with rage and confusion, his body warping under the influence of accumulated corruption. The transformation was gradual enough that Midir himself may not have recognized what was happening until it was far too late to stop or reverse the process. He continued his vigil, even as the abyss wormed deeper into his consciousness, continued to devour darkness, even as that darkness devoured him in turn. The irony is profound and terrible. His devotion became the instrument of his destruction, and his greatest success in protecting the city laid the foundation for his eventual transformation into one of its greatest threats. When the player encounters Midir, he is long past the point where reason or mercy might reach him. He has become a maddened beast whose attacks carry all the fury of a creature that knows, on some level, what has been done to it, but lacks the capacity to understand or articulate that knowledge. His body is massive beyond belief, dwarfing even the other enormous dragons encountered throughout the Dark Souls series, and every inch of that vast form radiates corruption and barely contained rage. His breath weapon is not the conventional fire of most dragons, but rather a laser beam of pure dark energy, concentrated corruption given form and direction with destructive potential that exceeds almost anything else in the game. When he rears back and begins to charge this attack, the air itself seems to distort around him, reality bending under the weight of so much concentrated darkness. The beam, when it fires, carves through stone and steel with equal ease, leaving trenches in the earth and removing any unfortunate souls caught in its path so completely that they might never have existed at all. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Midir's boss fight is the location in which it takes place. The arena is a vast, empty chamber deep in the earth, a place where the dragon has clearly spent ages in isolation, cut off from the city he once protected, separated from any companionship or comfort. Here, in the darkness he devoted his life to consuming, Midir makes his final stand against invaders who have come to end his suffering. It is both boss fight and mercy killing, a battle against a creature who has long since ceased to be a meaningful threat to anything beyond his immediate vicinity, but whose continued existence is nevertheless too dangerous and too tragic to allow to continue. Shira, Knight of Filianor, is one of the few inhabitants of the ringed city who retains full consciousness and agency, and her story is intimately connected to both Midir's tragedy and the larger secret that lies at the heart of this strange place. She is found in a church-like structure, her armor pristine and her bearing noble, and she speaks with the clarity and purpose of someone who knows exactly what she is and what she has dedicated herself to protecting. Her devotion is to Princess Filianor, a mysterious figure whose name appears in the city's title, but whose nature and significance are not immediately apparent. Shira's request is straightforward. She asks the player to slay Darkita Midir, to end the suffering of a dragon who was once a loyal guardian but has become a corrupted beast. This request is framed as both mercy and necessity. Midir's madness makes him a danger to everything around him, and his continued existence serves no purpose beyond prolonging an agony that can have no resolution except death. The weight of this request is evident in Shira's manner. She does not ask lightly, does not treat this as a simple monster-hunting contract. She understands what Midir was, what he sacrificed, what he has become. To ask someone to kill such a creature is to acknowledge the ultimate failure of the system that created him, the inevitable endpoint of asking any being to carry a burden that can never be set down or shared. When the player succeeds in slaying Midir and returns to report this accomplishment, Shira's gratitude is genuine, but tinged with sorrow. She has watched over the dragon for a very long time, maintained her vigil as he slowly descended into madness, and his death, necessary though it was, represents the end of an era and the loss of one of the last living connections to the city's ancient past. In thanking the player, she is also mourning, acknowledging that something irreplaceable has been lost, even as she recognizes that this loss was inevitable and ultimately necessary. But Shira's story does not end with gratitude and mourning. Her true purpose, her ultimate loyalty, is not to the memory of what Medea once was, but to Princess Filianore and the preservation of the secret that Filianore's slumber maintained. When the player discovers and disturbs that slumber, when they reach out and touch Filianore in her egg-like chamber, Shira's gratitude transforms instantly into righteous fury. She invades the player's world, her previous civility abandoned entirely, her weapon raised with clear intent to kill. This sudden betrayal is not actually betrayal at all, but rather the logical conclusion of her character arc. Shira is a guardian first and foremost, and what she guards is not the physical city or even its inhabitants, but rather the illusion that Filianore maintains. The player's decision to wake the princess represents an attack on everything Shira has devoted her existence to protecting, and her response is the only response that her nature and oaths will allow. She fights with the desperation of someone who knows that failure means not just personal death but the destruction of everything she has ever valued, and her aggression reflects this understanding. Princess Filianore herself is discovered in a chamber that seems to exist outside the normal geography of the ringed city, a space that feels more like a dream or vision than a physical location. She lies in repose that is simultaneously peaceful and deeply unnatural, her form small and fragile, her eyes closed as if in deep sleep. Around her are what appear to be egg-like structures, though whether these are protective barriers, stasis chambers, or something else entirely remains ambiguous. The temptation to reach out and touch her is strong, driven by the same curiosity that has propelled the player through so many other mysteries throughout the game. When this touch finally comes, when fingers brush against her sleeping form, the response is immediate and catastrophic. Filianore's eyes open, and in that moment of waking, something fundamental about reality itself shifts and breaks. The illusion maintained by her eternal sleep shatters like glass struck by a hammer, and what was hidden behind that illusion is suddenly terribly visible. The ringed city, that magnificent gift from the gods to humanity, is revealed to have been destroyed ages ago. The buildings that seemed so solid, the streets that felt so real beneath one's feet, the sky itself, all of it was maintained only through Filianore's slumber, a shared dream or hallucination that allowed the inhabitants to continue existing in a city that had long since ceased to be. The descent into Ulasil begins not with a journey through space, but with a passage through time itself, carried on the wings of a broken pendant whose origins are as mysterious as the destination it provides. This fragment of something larger, something that was once whole and purposeful, serves as a key that unlocks not a door but rather a moment, a specific point in history when everything that would follow was set in motion. To hold the pendant is to feel the weight of tragedy not yet occurred, to sense the presence of disasters that have already happened from one perspective but remain desperately, futilely preventable from another. The world that resolves into clarity around the traveler is Ulasil, as it existed in ages past, before the name became synonymous with corruption and horror, when it was still a kingdom known for gentle sorceries and peaceful people. This was a place where magic was not the domain of war mages and battle sorcerers, but rather of scholars and artists, where the manipulation of light and illusion served aesthetic purposes more often than martial ones. The architecture speaks of a culture that valued beauty and learning, with towers designed for contemplation rather than defense, and gardens laid out according to principles of harmony rather than strategic necessity. But the Ulasil the traveler encounters is this peaceful kingdom in its death throes, a civilization collapsing in real time under the weight of something it cannot understand and never intended to unleash. The streets that should bustle with scholars and merchants are instead prowled by creatures that were once human but have been twisted by dark sorcery into bloated monstrosities. Their bodies are distended beyond all natural proportion, stretched and deformed until they barely retain any recognizable human characteristics, and from their hands stream magics that have nothing to do with Ulasil's traditional gentle sorceries and everything to do with the darkness that has infected every corner of their world. The transformation of the populace is not uniform in its effects, but rather reflects the fundamental nature of each individual subjected to the corruption. Some have become shambling masses of flesh that can barely move under their own weight, their faces stretched into permanent expressions of confusion or anguish, as if some part of them still remembers what they once were. Others have retained more mobility but lost any semblance of higher function, attacking anything that moves with magic that pours from them in uncontrolled torrents, as much affliction to themselves as weapon against their enemies. The air itself feels wrong in this dying kingdom, thick with something that is not quite mist and not quite smoke, a presence that seems to have weight and intention beyond mere atmospheric phenomena. This is the abyss made manifest. The darkness of humanity run wild and unconstrained by the usual boundaries that keep such power contained within individual souls. It presses against the skin like cold water, seeps into the lungs with each breath, and whispers in voices that are almost but not quite comprehensible, suggesting truths that the conscious mind rejects, but some deeper part of the psyche recognizes and fears. Princess Dusk of Ulasil, when she is finally discovered and freed from her crystalline prison, provides some context for the catastrophe that has befallen her homeland. She speaks of scholars who delved too greedily into ancient magics, of research that crossed boundaries that should have remained inviolate, of the moment when their curiosity exceeded their wisdom and unleashed something that could not be controlled or contained. Her words carry the weight of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that she alone of all her people has retained her sanity and her form, while everyone she ever knew has been transformed into something monstrous. The scholars of Ulasil had sought to understand the nature of the primeval human, to delve into the origins of humanity itself, and unlock secrets that had been buried since before the Age of Fire began. Their excavations, both physical and metaphysical, eventually disturbed something that had been sleeping in the deepest, darkest places beneath their kingdom. They found a grave, ancient beyond measure, and in their hubris they opened it, disturbing the rest of something that should have been allowed to remain undisturbed for all eternity. What they awakened was Manus, father of the abyss, and the title alone hints at the magnitude of their error. This was not merely a powerful sorcerer or a dangerous monster, but rather something fundamental, a being whose very existence predated the conceptual frameworks that would later be used to understand magic and humanity and darkness. Manus was a primeval human, one of the first of his kind, and his humanity had not been tempered or shaped by the ages of civilization that followed. It was raw and wild and impossibly powerful, and when it was disturbed from its long sleep, it erupted outward with force that shattered the careful boundaries between the human soul and the external world. The abyss that spreads from Manus is not something he creates or controls in any conscious sense, but rather something he is, the physical manifestation of his humanity's darkness, made external and unleashed upon the world. It is described in some texts as humanity run wild, the dark soul freed from all constraints and allowed to express itself without limitation or direction. This darkness has no inherent malice, no conscious desire to corrupt or destroy, but its effects are nevertheless catastrophic, because human darkness, when unconstrained, naturally consumes and transforms everything it touches. The catalyst for Manus's awakening, the specific injury that roused him from his ancient slumber, was the desecration of his grave and the theft of something precious that had been buried with him. The broken pendant that serves as key to this entire journey through time is, it is revealed, a fragment of something that once belonged to Manus, a keepsake from someone he loved in the distant past before the age of fire, before the concept of ages had any meaning. This pendant was his last connection to whoever that person had been, the final anchor, linking him to the time when he was something other than the father of the abyss, and its theft from his grave was a violation so profound that it pierced even the deepest sleep and dragged him back to a waking state that could only be characterized as rage. The rage of Manus is not the hot fury of an insulted warrior, or the calculated anger of a wronged king, but rather something more primal and all-consuming, closer to the blind wrath of a natural disaster than to any human emotion. He does not plan or scheme, does not build armies or forge alliances, does not seek to conquer or rule. He simply reaches out with his massive distorted form and his reality-warping magic, trying to reclaim what was taken from him while simultaneously destroying everything and everyone that stands between him and that goal. The abyss that spreads from him is both weapon and byproduct of this quest. The manifestation of his desperation and loss, made physical and given the power to reshape the world around him. His lair in the chasm of the abyss is a place that seems to exist outside normal geometry, where walls curve in directions that should be impossible, and distances seem to shift depending on the angle from which they are viewed. The floor is slick with something that might be water or oil or liquid darkness, and touching it produces a sensation that is simultaneously cold and burning, numbing and agonizing. The air is so thick with accumulated corruption that moving through it feels like wading through deep water, each step requiring conscious effort against resistance that is as much psychological as physical. When Manus himself is finally encountered, his form is both smaller and vastly larger than expectation might suggest. He is humanoid in the loosest sense, with a torso and head and limbs arranged in roughly the proportions one might expect from a human figure. But everything is wrong in ways that make the mind recoil from sustained observation. His left arm is grotesquely elongated, stretching far beyond natural proportion, and ending in a hand whose fingers can wrap around a human body multiple times over. This arm serves as his primary weapon, reaching across impossible distances to grab at intruders or smash them against the ground with force sufficient to shatter bones and rupture organs. His head, if it can properly be called such, is a mass of darkness punctuated by what might be an eye, or might simply be a concentration of malevolent intent given form. There is no face in any conventional sense, no features that might suggest personality or humanity, only this single point of awful awareness that tracks movement and fixes upon targets with predatory focus. When he roars, the sound seems to come from everywhere at once, rather than emanating from any specific point on his body. A cacophony of anguish and fury that carries within it echoes of countless other voices, as if all of Ulasal's transformed citizens are screaming through him. His attacks combine overwhelming physical power with magic that warps reality in ways that make conventional defense nearly impossible. The dark sorceries that pour from him are not discrete spells with clear beginnings and endings, but rather continuous streams of corruption that saturate the entire arena, forcing constant movement and making any pause or hesitation potentially fatal. These magics manifest as raining projectiles of condensed darkness, as explosions that erupt from the ground without warning, as waves of force that sweep across the entire battlefield and knock aside anything in their path. But perhaps the most dangerous attack in his arsenal is also the most deceptively simple. He reaches out with that impossibly long arm and attempts to grab any who dare challenge him. Those caught in his grasp find themselves pulled into close proximity with the source of the abyss itself, exposed to concentrated corruption that can overwhelm even the strongest defenses in moments. The physical crushing is terrible enough, bones cracking under pressure that no human frame was designed to withstand. But the spiritual damage is even worse. To be held by Manus is to be exposed directly to humanity's darkness in its purest and most concentrated form, and many who survive the physical trauma find their minds shattered by what they experienced in those few seconds of terrible intimacy. The battle against Manus is ultimately a battle against the consequences of curiosity, unchecked by wisdom, against the dangers inherent in disturbing things that should be left at rest. His defeat does not undo the damage that has been done to Ulasil, does not restore the transformed citizens to their original forms, or reverse the corruption that has saturated every stone and tree in the kingdom. It merely ends the source of new corruption, seals away the wellspring from which the abyss flowed, and allows the slow process of natural decay to begin reclaiming what dark sorcery had transformed. But the story of Ulasal's fall is not complete without understanding the full tragedy of Artorias the Abyss Walker, the legendary knight whose intervention came too late, and whose defeat represents one of the most poignant failures in all of Dark Souls lore. Artorias was one of the 4 knights of Gwyn, warriors of such skill and dedication that their names became synonymous with excellence in their respective domains. Where Ornstein was the captain and dragonslayer, where Kiaran was the assassin who struck from shadows, where Goff was the archer whose aim never failed, Artorias was the Abyss Walker, the knight who had sworn an oath to traverse the abyss itself and combat the darkness wherever it appeared. His equipment and reputation both speak to his specialization in fighting against corruption and dark sorcery. The ring he wore granted him the ability to move through the abyss without being consumed by it, creating a protective barrier that allowed him to enter places where others would be instantly overwhelmed by concentrated darkness. His greatsword was massive and perfectly balanced, designed for powerful sweeping attacks that could cut through multiple enemies in a single strike. His great shield was nearly as tall as he was, providing protection sufficient to weather even the most intense magical assaults. When word reached Anor Londo of Ulasal's fall and the spread of the abyss, Artorias did not hesitate. He departed immediately for the stricken kingdom, bringing with him only his weapons, his ring, and his companion, a great grey wolf named Sif. The journey from the city of the gods to the distant kingdom of sorcerers was long and dangerous, but Artorias had faced danger countless times before and never faltered in his duty. He was, by all accounts, the perfect choice for this mission, a warrior whose entire life had been preparation for exactly this moment. What he found when he arrived in Ulasil was worse than any report had suggested. The abyss had spread through the kingdom with terrifying speed, transforming the peaceful realm into a nightmare landscape where reality itself seemed to be breaking down under the weight of so much concentrated darkness. The citizens were already lost, twisted into monstrous forms that bore only passing resemblance to what they had once been. The buildings were crumbling as the very stone lost cohesion, infected by corruption that attacked not just living things, but the fundamental structure of matter itself. Artorias fought his way toward the source of the corruption with the determination that had made him legendary, his sword carving paths through hordes of twisted creatures, while his shield weathered attacks that would have vaporized lesser warriors. But even his considerable skill and legendary equipment proved insufficient against the sheer magnitude of the darkness he faced. The abyss was not simply enemy forces that could be defeated through superior tactics or greater strength, but rather an environment, a presence that pressed in from all sides, and sought to overwhelm through sheer persistent pressure, rather than through any single overwhelming attack. The moment of his fall came when he was finally overwhelmed by the corruption he had spent his life fighting against. The exact circumstances remain unclear, lost to the chaos of battle and the distorting effects of the abyss itself. But the result was devastating. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, the knight who had sworn to traverse darkness without being consumed, found himself drowning in the very thing he had devoted his existence to combating. The abyss poured into him, overwhelming his defenses and beginning the process of corruption that would transform him from protector into threat. In what may have been his final moment of clarity, Artorias made a choice that speaks to the depth of his character and the strength of his love for his companion. He gave his great shield to Sif, placing it over the young wolf to create a protective barrier that might keep the darkness at bay. This act meant abandoning his own defense, leaving himself more vulnerable to the corruption that was already beginning to consume him. But Artorias made that sacrifice without hesitation. If he could not save himself, he could at least save one innocent life. And perhaps that would be enough. The Artorias that the player encounters in the Abyss is not the legendary knight at the height of his power, but rather a corrupted shadow of that former glory, a warrior fighting with his offhand because his sword arm has been shattered and hangs useless at his side. Yet even diminished, even corrupted, even wielding his massive greatsword in his weaker hand, he remains one of the most formidable opponents in the entire game. His movements are wild and acrobatic, combining impossible leaps with spinning attacks that cover huge areas, and his aggression is relentless in ways that leave little opportunity for healing or recovery. The arena where this battle takes place adds another layer of tragedy to the encounter. It is a colosseum, an ancient structure that suggests this place once hosted games or ceremonies, and arrayed in the seats around the fighting floor are the corrupted citizens of Ulasil. They watch the battle with whatever passes for attention in their transformed state, witnesses to the fall of the knight who came to save them and who now serves as dark entertainment in the ruins of their civilization. The descent into Shulva begins with the discovery of a passage that leads not merely downward through earth and stone, but backward through time, toward an age when dragons were gods and humanity still cowered in the dark places of the Pais world. This is the Sanctum City, a kingdom that was built underground, not for protection from external enemies, but rather to contain and worship something that dwelt in the depths, something that required both reverence and eternal vigilance to prevent catastrophe. The very existence of such a place speaks to a philosophy fundamentally different from the fortress cities and towering castles that would characterize later ages, a worldview that understood power not as something to be conquered and wielded, but rather as something to be carefully managed and eternally respected. The architecture of Shulva is a marvel that would inspire awe even without understanding the purpose it serves. Pyramids rise from the cavern floor, their sides carved with such precision that the seams between individual stones are nearly invisible, their angles calculated according to principles that combine aesthetic beauty with structural necessity, and perhaps with spiritual significance that modern minds can only guess at. Temples are carved directly from the living rock of the cave walls, their interiors hollowed out and shaped into spaces that seem designed to make even giants feel small and insignificant, to remind all who enter of their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. The lighting throughout the city comes not from torches or conventional fires, but from some combination of bioluminescence and ancient magic, creating an atmosphere that is simultaneously ethereal and oppressive. The illumination is just sufficient to see by, revealing enough detail to navigate and fight and observe, but never quite enough to feel truly safe or comfortable. Shadows pool in corners and alcoves, and the eye constantly plays tricks, suggesting movement where there is none, or perhaps failing to notice genuine threats until they are already dangerously close. Water flows through Shulva in carefully engineered channels, its path controlled by mechanisms so old that they have become part of the natural landscape, indistinguishable from geological formations, except to the most careful observer. But this water is not clean or pure or safe to drink. It carries poison, subtle at first but accumulating with exposure, until even brief contact can prove debilitating or fatal. This poison is described as a gift from Sin, the slumbering dragon, though whether this gift was intentional or merely an unavoidable consequence of his presence remains ambiguous in the fragmentary texts that survive. The Sanctum Knights, who patrol the city's passages and guard its most sacred spaces, are humanity's answer to the question of how mortal warriors might stand eternal watch over something that transcends mortality. They are not living in any conventional sense, yet neither are they simple undead, animated by dark sorcery or divine miracle. Rather, they exist in some liminal state between life and death, their consciousness sustained across millennia through means that combine dedication, magic, and sheer force of will. Their armor has fused with their bodies over the countless ages, becoming part of their physical form rather than merely covering it, and their movements suggest both the discipline of trained soldiers and the mechanical precision of animated constructs. These knights perform their duties with the same efficiency and dedication they displayed when they first took up their posts in an age so distant that even the memory of it has faded from history. They patrol the same routes, maintain the same formations, respond to threats with the same tactical coordination that once made them feared across the known world. That the threats they face now are often hollow explorers and treasure seekers rather than the armies and monsters they were trained to combat does not diminish their vigilance or their effectiveness. A duty assumed in ancient times does not expire simply because the world has changed beyond all recognition. The Sanctum soldiers who fight alongside the knights are equally dedicated but less transformed by their long service, retaining more of their original human appearance, even as they too have become something other than conventionally alive. They wield spears and shields with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and precise, wasting no energy on flourishes or unnecessary display. In combat, they function as a unit, supporting one another with the kind of seamless cooperation that speaks to centuries of fighting side by side, learning each other's rhythms and anticipating each other's actions without need for verbal communication. But not all who came to Shulva did so with pure intentions or noble purpose. The Drakeblood Knights represent ambition unchecked by wisdom, the desire for power pursued without regard for consequence or cost. These warriors came from distant lands, drawn by legends of Sin, the slumbering dragon, and the power contained within dragon's blood. They believed, as many have believed across the ages, that consuming or incorporating dragon blood could grant strength and longevity beyond normal human limits, could elevate mere mortals to something approaching the majesty and terror of the ancient everlasting dragons who once ruled the world. Their invasion of Shulva was not a military campaign in the conventional sense, not an attempt to conquer territory or subjugate populations, but rather a focused mission to reach Sin himself and claim his blood for their own purposes. They fought their way through the Sanctum Knights and soldiers with determination born of obsession, pushing ever deeper into the city's heart, despite mounting casualties and increasing resistance. The defenders of Shulva understood what the Drakeblood Knights sought, and knew with absolute certainty that allowing them to succeed would mean catastrophe, not just for the city, but potentially for the world beyond. The final confrontation between the invaders and the defenders took place in the deepest chambers of the sanctum, in spaces so close to Sin's resting place that the air itself was thick with poison and the stone walls wept with condensed toxins. Here the Drakeblood Knights made their ultimate push, sacrificing everything in a desperate attempt to reach their goal. And here the defenders of Shulva made their final stand, knowing that failure would mean the awakening of something that had slumbered for ages and must continue to slumber if the world was to remain stable. The defenders failed. Despite their dedication, despite their superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain, despite fighting with the desperation of those who understand exactly what is at stake, they could not prevent the Drakeblood Knights from reaching Sin. The dragon was disturbed from his ancient sleep, roused by the combination of combat, magical discharge, and the sheer concentrated intention focused upon his resting place. His awakening was not the gradual return to consciousness of something that had merely been sleeping, but rather the violent eruption of something that had been sealed away, a breaking of bonds that were never meant to be broken and could not be restored once shattered. The poison that had always been present in Shulva, that subtle contamination that required care and preparation to safely navigate, intensified 1,000-fold in the moment of Sin's awakening. It poured from his body like blood from a mortal wound, saturating the air and the water and the stone itself, transforming the entire underground kingdom from a place that was merely dangerous to one that was actively hostile to all life. The Drakeblood Knights, who had sought dragon blood as a source of power, found themselves drowning in it, their bodies absorbing the poison faster than they could metabolize or expel it, their victory transforming instantly into the most profound and terrible defeat. But they did not die, or at least not in any way that allowed them to escape the consequences of their actions. The combination of dragon blood, their own desperate desire for power, and the unique magical environment of Shulva transformed them into something that was neither alive nor dead, neither human nor dragon. They became corrupted versions of what they had once been, their forms warped by the very power they had sought to claim, and they were bound to the city they had violated, condemned to wander its passages as eternal guardians of the dragon they had awakened, their punishment to serve the very purpose they had sought to subvert. Deep within the sanctum, past layers of defenders, both ancient and newly corrupted, lies the throne room where Ilana the Squalid Queen holds court over ruins and memories. She is a fragment of Manus, one of several pieces into which the Father of the Abyss was divided after his defeat in Ulasil, and her very existence speaks to the persistent and fragmentary nature of humanity's darkness. Where Manus was a concentrated mass of primeval humanity's shadow, Ilana is that same darkness, diluted and given specific form and purpose, shaped by circumstance and choice into something that retains aspects of the original, while developing characteristics unique to her particular manifestation. The title Squalid Queen is revealing in its implications, suggesting degradation and corruption that might once have been nobility or at least dignity. Squalor is not merely poverty or simplicity, but rather the specific kind of filth that comes from neglect and decay, from things falling apart that were once maintained and cared for. Ilana's kingdom, such as it is, consists of a city that still functions but has lost its original purpose, defenders who continue their eternal vigil but no longer remember why, and a dragon whose slumber was meant to be eternal but has been disrupted beyond repair. Her role as protector of Sin is both ironic and tragically appropriate. She guards the dragon not because she wishes to prevent his awakening, for that awakening has already occurred and cannot be reversed, but rather because protecting him is the purpose that has been assigned to her, the role that gives meaning to her existence in a world that has moved on and forgotten the reasons why such protection was necessary. She is the sunken king's bride, though whether this relationship was one of genuine affection or merely political arrangement remains unclear from the fragmentary evidence that survives, and her dedication to his kingdom persists long after the king himself has passed into dust and memory. The throne room where she awaits challengers is a space of faded grandeur, its magnificence dimmed by ages of accumulating grime and neglect, but still visible beneath the corruption. The throne itself is massive and ornate, carved from a single piece of stone with such skill that it seems almost to be a natural formation rather than a work of human hands, and Elana sits upon it with the posture of someone who has held this position for so long that it has become indistinguishable from her identity. She does not pace or fidget or show any of the restless energy that characterizes the living, but rather maintains an almost statuesque stillness, moving only when combat demands it. Her combat style reflects her nature as both sorceress and queen, combining powerful dark magic with the ability to summon assistance from sources that transcend normal understanding. The dark orbs she conjures float through the air with deceptive slowness before exploding with force sufficient to shatter stone and bone alike, their trajectories unpredictable and their impacts devastating. The ground beneath her enemies erupts with spikes of crystallized darkness, and waves of corrupting energy sweep across the arena in patterns that force constant movement and make any attempt at maintaining distance a temporary strategy at best. But perhaps her most fearsome ability is her capacity to summon defenders to her aid, pulling them through barriers between worlds or states of being with magic that should not be possible yet clearly is. Sometimes she calls forth Velstadt the Royal Aegis, that legendary warrior who served kings in ages past, and whose devotion transcended even death. His appearance in Elana's throne room, so far from the kingdoms he swore to protect, raises questions about the nature of service and sacrifice that have no comfortable answers. Other times she summons lesser defenders, skeletal warriors who rise from the ground in numbers that can quickly overwhelm even prepared challengers, their individual weakness compensated for by sheer quantity, and their willingness to throw themselves into combat without regard for their own preservation. Fighting through these waves of summoned assistance, while simultaneously dealing with Elana's own considerable magical arsenal, requires patience and careful resource management, a willingness to endure extended combat rather than seeking quick resolution. Each summoned defender must be dealt with before focusing on Elana herself, yet allowing her too much freedom to cast her dark magics while dealing with her summons is equally dangerous. The battle becomes a careful dance of prioritization and positioning, of knowing when to commit to offense and when to focus purely on survival. Beyond Elana's throne room, past the final defenses and through passages that seem designed more to test worthiness than to actually prevent entry, lies the sanctum's deepest secret and most sacred trust. Sin, the slumbering dragon, rests here in a chamber so vast that its ceiling disappears into darkness beyond the reach of any light source, so deep beneath the earth that the weight of the world above is almost palpable in the air. This is a space that predates human civilization, that was perhaps discovered rather than built, a natural cathedral in which the dragon was sealed or chose to sleep in an age before history began keeping records. Sin himself is magnificent in ways that make even his corrupted state appear somehow noble. He is smaller than some of the truly ancient dragons encountered in other ages, but his form is perfectly proportioned, and his movements retain grace, despite the obvious pain that each motion causes. His scales, which should gleam with the iridescence characteristic of healthy dragons, are instead dulled by accumulated poison and marked by countless scars from battles fought in ages past. Most striking are the spears that jut from his body, massive weapons that were driven into his flesh by warriors long dead, their shafts broken but their heads still embedded, eternal monuments to conflicts whose details have been lost to time. These spears are not merely decoration or environmental detail, but rather crucial elements of Sin's story, evidence of the battles that were fought to contain him and the price that was paid by those who sought to keep him sleeping. Each spear represents a warrior who got close enough to strike, who possessed sufficient courage and skill to pierce dragon scales that could turn aside conventional weapons, and who likely paid for that achievement with their life. The spears remain because they cannot be removed without causing even greater trauma, because pulling them free would create wounds that might never heal, and so they have become part of Sin himself, integrated into his physical form through centuries of adaptation. The poison that emanates from Sin is not the fiery breath characteristic of most dragons, but rather a toxic fog that fills the entire chamber, accumulating in the lungs with each breath and saturating clothing and armor through mere contact. This poison is not immediately lethal, but rather debilitating, slowing reactions and clouding judgment, making every moment of combat more dangerous than the one before as the effects accumulate and compound. Fighting Sin requires not only the usual considerations of timing and positioning, but also careful management of antidotes and protective equipment, constant awareness of toxin levels, and their impact on performance. His combat style combines the ground-based attacks expected of a dragon with aerial maneuvers that take full advantage of the chamber's immense vertical space. He launches himself into the air with powerful beats of wings that create gusts sufficient to knock warriors off their feet, circles overhead while raining toxic breath down upon those below, then crashes back to earth with impacts that crack the stone floor and send shockwaves rippling outward. On the ground, he uses his massive body as a weapon, sweeping with his tail to clear space around him, snapping with jaws that could bite a human in half, clawing with talons that can pierce even the heaviest armor. The choice to fight Sin or to leave him in his tormented rest is one that carries weight beyond simple gameplay considerations. To slay him is to end suffering that has continued for centuries, to grant mercy to a being who has long since ceased to pose any genuine threat beyond the boundaries of his chamber. Yet it is also to destroy something irreplaceable, to eliminate one of the last living connections to an age when dragons ruled and humanity cowered, to extinguish a light that, however dimmed by pain and poison, still represents a kind of majesty that the world will not see again. Broom Tower rises from the landscape like a monument to hubris and ambition, its iron construction speaking of an age when humanity believed that industry and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle and solve any problem. This is not the elegant stonework of older kingdoms, or the organic architecture of places built in harmony with their environment, but rather something deliberately imposing, aggressively industrial, designed to dominate the landscape rather than complement it. Every surface is scorched metal, every passage filled with the sound of groaning iron and the scent of burning oil, every chamber permeated with heat that makes the air shimmer and distort. The tower was the old Iron King's greatest achievement, or at least what he considered his greatest achievement in the years before his fall. It represented the pinnacle of his kingdom's industrial capacity, a demonstration that human engineering could rival the natural fortresses of mountains or the divine architecture of the gods themselves. Within its walls were forges that could produce weapons and armor of unparalleled quality, smelting chambers capable of processing ore at rates that would have seemed impossible to previous generations, and storage facilities designed to hold enough military equipment to outfit armies that numbered in the thousands. But the tower was more than merely functional. It was also symbolic, a statement of power and permanence built to endure across ages and to serve as eternal reminder of the king who commissioned it. The height alone was meant to inspire awe, rising so far into the ash-choked sky that its upper levels disappeared into perpetual haze. The thickness of its walls suggested invulnerability, protection against any conceivable siege or assault. The complexity of its internal mechanisms demonstrated mastery over forces that lesser civilizations could barely understand, let alone harness for their own purposes. Yet for all its impressive construction and undeniable functionality, Broom Tower carries within it the seeds of the tragedy that would eventually consume the kingdom it was built to protect. The same industrial processes that made it powerful also made it dangerous, filling its corridors with toxic fumes and creating zones of heat so intense that unprotected flesh would blister and char within moments of exposure. The mechanisms that powered its forges and lifts required constant maintenance and consumed fuel at rates that could only be sustained through aggressive expansion and resource extraction, creating dependencies that made the kingdom vulnerable to disruption of its supply chains. The ashen idols that stand in key locations throughout the tower represent one of the most insidious aspects of its corruption and one of the most frustrating obstacles for those who would explore its depths. These statues appear at first glance to be merely decorative, representations of some figure from the kingdom's history or mythology, rendered in metal and stone, and placed in niches and alcoves, as one might place religious icons in a temple. But their true function becomes apparent when combat begins near them, when the wounds that should accumulate on enemies instead heal with supernatural speed, when stamina that should deplete remains inexhaustibly available, when attacks that should stagger and interrupt instead merely bounce off without effect. The idols are not simply healing their allies through conventional magic or divine miracle, but rather channeling some deeper power, drawing on reserves that seem limitless, and distributing that energy to all who serve the tower's corrupted will. Fighting near an active idol transforms even the most routine encounters into wars of attrition that can drain resources and patience in equal measure. Battles that stretch on and on, as enemies refuse to stay damaged and refuse to succumb to injuries that would have felled them instantly anywhere else. The solution to this problem comes in the form of smelter wedges, peculiar objects that can be driven into the idols to disrupt their function and silence their healing influence. But these wedges are limited in number and spread throughout the tower, in locations that require careful exploration and considerable risk to reach, creating a strategic layer where decisions about which idols to disable and which to leave active can significantly impact the difficulty of subsequent encounters. Each wedge used represents a choice, a permanent commitment that cannot be reversed, and the knowledge that there are more idols than wedges available means that some healing influences will necessarily remain active, regardless of how thoroughly one explores. The heat within Broom Tower is not merely uncomfortable, but actively hostile, an environmental hazard that must be managed through careful preparation and constant awareness. The sources of this heat are the massive forges and smelting chambers that occupy the tower's lower levels, industrial installations of such size and power that they continue to function even in the absence of anyone to tend them, their fires burning with a persistence that suggests either incredible engineering or supernatural intervention, or perhaps some combination of both. The air above these installations shimmers and distorts, making accurate judgment of distances difficult and causing visual artifacts that can make navigation treacherous. Those who venture into the hottest areas without adequate protection find their health depleting simply from environmental exposure, independent of any combat or other immediate threat. The rate of this depletion increases the longer one remains in these zones, and the deeper one penetrates into the heart of the industrial complex, creating a soft time limit on exploration that adds pressure and urgency to what might otherwise be careful, methodical progress. Special equipment can mitigate this damage but cannot eliminate it entirely, and even the best protection will eventually prove insufficient if exposure continues long enough. Sir Elon represents a strange temporal anomaly within the tower's already complex relationship with time and memory. He is not encountered in the present, not found wandering the tower's corridors as a hollow or a reanimated corpse, but rather exists within a memory, a preserved moment from the past that can be accessed through special means. This memory takes the form of a pristine chamber untouched by the decay and corruption that has claimed the rest of the tower, a space that looks exactly as it did in the days when Sir Elon served as captain of the old Iron King's forces, and the kingdom still stood at the height of its power. The contrast between this preserved memory and the ruined present serves to emphasize just how far the kingdom has fallen and how complete its destruction has been. In the memory, the floor is polished to a mirror shine. The walls are free of soot and damage, and the air is clear rather than choked with ash and toxic fumes. This is the tower as it was meant to be, as the old Iron King dreamed it would remain for all eternity. And the fact that this perfection now exists only as a memory that can be briefly visited, but never truly returned, to adds a melancholy dimension to the entire experience. Sir Elon himself is a warrior from the distant east, a land so far removed from the kingdoms of the west that even basic details about its culture and customs remain mysterious and poorly understood. His fighting style reflects this eastern origin, incorporating techniques and movements that have no parallel in Western martial traditions. Where Western knights favor powerful overhead strikes and broad sweeping attacks, Sir Elon employs precision cuts and lightning-fast draws, his katana remaining sheathed until the exact moment when it needs to be deployed, and then returning to its scabbard almost before the eye can register that it was ever drawn. This fighting style, known as Iaijutsu in the eastern lands from which he came, represents the refinement of swordsmanship to its most essential and efficient form. Every movement serves a purpose. Every gesture contains within it the potential for lethal force, and there is no wasted motion or unnecessary flourish. To watch Sir Elon fight is to witness martial art elevated to a level that approaches religious practice, where technique and philosophy merge into something that transcends simple combat and becomes a form of meditation expressed through violence. His service to the old Iron King is a matter of historical record, but the circumstances that brought him to these western lands remain frustratingly obscure. The texts speak of his arrival as if it were foreordained, as if the meeting between Eastern warrior and Western king was destiny rather than chance, but they provide no details about what motivated his departure from his homeland or what he sought in these foreign kingdoms. What is clear is that his skill and dedication made him invaluable, that he rose quickly to become captain of the king's forces, and that his leadership was instrumental in the military successes that allowed the kingdom to expand and prosper. His mysterious departure before the kingdom's fall raises questions that the available evidence cannot satisfactorily answer. Some texts suggest that he left of his own accord, that he recognized some fundamental flaw in the kingdom's trajectory and chose to distance himself before catastrophe struck. Others hint at disagreement or conflict with the king, a falling out between master and servant that resulted in voluntary exile. Still others propose that his departure was part of some larger plan, that he left not in anger or fear, but rather to pursue objectives that could not be accomplished while remaining in the king's service. The memory of the old Iron King in which Sir Elon can be encountered exists as a frozen moment from before this departure, a time when he still served faithfully and the kingdom still stood strong. To enter this memory and face him in combat is to challenge not a hollow shell or corrupted remnant, but rather the man himself at the absolute peak of his abilities, uncorrupted by time or dark sorcery, fighting with the full measure of skill and determination that made him legendary. The arena where this confrontation takes place is a simple rectangular chamber, elegant in its austerity, with none of the environmental hazards or complicated terrain features that characterize many boss arenas. This simplicity is itself a kind of statement, an acknowledgement that the challenge here comes purely from the opponent's skill rather than from tricks or gimmicks. There is nowhere to hide, no elevation changes to exploit, no pillars to use as shields. There is only the warrior and his opponent, meeting in honest combat where superiority will be determined solely by technique and determination. Sir Elon's attacks come in rapid sequences that blend offense and defense seamlessly, his movements flowing from one to the next without pause or transition. He advances with shuffling steps that maintain perfect balance while covering ground with deceptive speed, closes distance before opponents can react, and delivers cuts that can end the fight in a single exchange if they connect cleanly. His most dangerous technique is perhaps his grab attack, a move where he sheathes his sword and then draws it in a motion so fast it appears instantaneous, the blade passing through his opponent's body and emerging from the other side before being cleaned and returned to its scabbard in a gesture that is simultaneously practical and ceremonial. Those caught by this attack find themselves impaled on the katana, held in place for a moment that seems to stretch into eternity, and then dropped as Sir Elon withdraws his blade and steps back. The damage from this technique is not merely physical but also carries a psychological component, the humiliation of being so thoroughly and completely defeated by a single perfect motion. For many challengers, surviving this attack is itself a victory, proof that they can withstand even Sir Elon's most devastating technique and continue fighting. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sir Elon's encounter occurs not during the fight but after it, in the event that should occur when a challenger defeats him without taking damage, fighting perfectly from beginning to end. In this circumstance, Sir Elon performs seppuku, the ritual suicide that represents the samurai's response to dishonor or failure. He kneels, draws a blade across his own abdomen, and dies by his own hand rather than at his opponent's, acknowledging through this final act that his defeat represents failure so profound that death is the only acceptable response. This gesture speaks to a code of honor so absolute and uncompromising that it makes no accommodation for the possibility of honorable defeat, a philosophy that sees failure in combat not as an unfortunate outcome, but as a fundamental negation of one's worth and purpose. It is both beautiful and terrible in its implications, representing dedication to ideals that transcend self-preservation, but also suggesting a worldview that allows no room for growth through adversity or redemption through future success. Fume Night Rain represents a very different kind of tragedy, one rooted not in honor or duty, but in betrayal and the corrosive effects of false accusation. He was once the left hand of the old Iron King, serving as counterpart and complement to Velstadt, the royal aegis, the right hand. Together they formed the king's most trusted advisors and his most formidable defenders. Two warriors whose loyalty seemed absolute, and whose combined might appeared sufficient to protect against any conceivable threat. But their partnership contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, tensions and jealousies that remained hidden beneath surface cooperation until events conspired to bring them into the open. The specifics of what drove them apart remain unclear, deliberately obscured in the historical record, or perhaps simply lost to the chaos that accompanied the kingdom's fall. What is documented is that accusations were made, that Rhaim was charged with treason or betrayal or some crime serious enough to warrant his exile from the kingdom he had served so faithfully. Whether these accusations were true or false, whether they represented genuine wrongdoing or merely political maneuvering by rivals who saw an opportunity to eliminate a competitor, the texts do not make clear. What they do reveal is that Rhaim maintained his innocence, that he refused to accept the judgment passed upon him, and that his exile was accompanied by bitter resentment toward both the king who condemned him and Velstadt, who apparently played some role in his downfall. His journey after exile led him eventually to Broom Tower, where he found purpose in service to Nedalia, the Bride of Ash, one of the fragments of Manus, who had sought but failed to fulfill her intended role. The transformation that Rhaim underwent during this period was not merely spiritual or philosophical, but also physical and magical, as he gradually shed the trappings of his former identity and embraced a new existence defined by darkness rather than light. His armor, once pristine and carefully maintained, became scorched and mismatched. Pieces from different sets combined according to function rather than aesthetic, creating an appearance that spoke of pragmatism born from hardship. The kingdom of Eliam Lois exists in a state of frozen preservation, encased in ice so thick and so pervasive that it has transformed the entire realm into something resembling a sculpture, more than a place where living beings once walked and worked and loved. This is not the natural ice of winter that melts with spring's arrival, not the temporary freeze that grips northern lands during their coldest months, but rather something fundamental and seemingly eternal, a crystallization of the kingdom at the precise moment of its greatest catastrophe. The ice is beautiful in the way that all perfectly preserved things possess a kind of beauty, but it is also deeply unsettling, a reminder that perfection in preservation is simply another word for death. The approach to Eliam Lois reveals the scope of what was lost here through the very completeness of its preservation. Buildings stand exactly as they did in the moment when the freeze descended, their windows unbroken, their doors closed against a cold that came from within rather than without. Streets are empty, but not abandoned in the conventional sense, for there are no signs of flight or panic, no scattered belongings or overturned carts that would suggest residents fleeing in terror. Instead, there is simply absence, as if the entire population vanished in an instant, or perhaps never existed at all, as if the city were built as a monument to emptiness rather than as a home for living people. The Oracle Knights who patrol these frozen streets represent the kingdom's final defenders, warriors who remained at their posts even as ice claimed everything around them. They are not hollow in the conventional sense, not mindless undead animated by dark sorcery or trapped souls forced to repeat meaningless patterns. Rather, they are frozen in both body and purpose, their forms encased in ice that has become indistinguishable from armor, their consciousness preserved in a state that might be sleep, or might be something stranger and more terrible. When they move, ice cracks and falls from their joints, and when they attack, their weapons trail frost that lingers in the air long after the strike has passed. These knights fight with a coordination and tactical awareness that suggests they retain at least some measure of their original intelligence and training. They support one another in combat, maintaining formations that maximize their defensive advantages, while creating opportunities for coordinated strikes. They adapt to enemy tactics, adjusting their approach when straightforward assault proves ineffective. Yet there is also something mechanical about their movements, a lack of improvisation or creativity that suggests they are following deeply ingrained patterns rather than making moment-to-moment decisions based on changing circumstances. The beauty of Eliam Lois is undeniable, despite, or perhaps because of its desolation. The ice that covers everything refracts light in ways that create rainbows and halos, transforming even the simplest structures into crystalline wonders. Snowstorms sweep through the streets with a violence that would be terrifying if they were not also somehow majestic, walls of white that reduce visibility to nothing, while creating soundscapes that range from whistling screams to gentle whispers. The architecture itself, what can be seen beneath and through the ice, speaks of a culture that valued elegance and proportion, that understood buildings not merely as functional shelters, but as expressions of aesthetic ideals and civic pride. Exploring this frozen kingdom requires navigating not only its physical geography, but also the deeper mysteries of what happened here and why. The environmental storytelling is subtle but consistent, revealing through careful observation the sequence of events that led to the kingdom's current state. Certain areas show signs of hasty preparation, barricades erected, and defensive positions established as if against an approaching threat. Other locations suggest more organized responses, coordinated efforts to evacuate or protect vulnerable populations. Still others display evidence of the final desperate measures taken when it became clear that conventional defense would not suffice. Alsana, the silent oracle, waits in the heart of the frozen kingdom, and her presence provides both explanation for what occurred here and context for understanding the larger patterns that connect the various fragments of Manus across different kingdoms and ages. She is the fourth fragment of the Father of the Abyss, another piece of humanity's primeval darkness given form and purpose. But unlike her sisters who embraced corruption or sought to spread the abyss, Alsana chose a different path. She found in the Ivory King something that transformed her fundamental nature, or perhaps revealed aspects of that nature that might otherwise have remained dormant and unexpressed. The story of how a fragment of the abyss came to serve and eventually to love a king dedicated to combating that same abyss is one of the most poignant in all of Dark Souls lore. Alsana did not arrive in Eliam Lois with benevolent intentions or noble purpose. She came, like her sisters, carrying within her the darkness of Manus and the corrupting influence of the abyss. Her nature was to spread that corruption, to transform and consume, to drag everything down into the same primordial darkness from which humanity first emerged. This was not malice or conscious evil, but simply what she was, the inevitable expression of her existence. But the Ivory King did not respond to her presence with violence or rejection. He saw in her not merely a fragment of the abyss, but a being capable of choice. Someone who could decide what she would become, rather than being forever bound by what she had been. His treatment of her was marked by a combination of firmness and compassion, of clear boundaries and genuine acceptance. And gradually this treatment awakened in Alsana something that fragments of the abyss were not supposed to be capable of feeling. She began to care about the kingdom and its people, to value the order and beauty that the Ivory King had built, and eventually that caring deepened into something that could only be called love. This transformation did not erase her nature or eliminate the darkness she carried within her. She remained a fragment of Manus, still connected to the abyss in ways that could never be completely severed. But she learned to direct that darkness toward protective rather than destructive ends, to use her understanding of corruption to help defend against it rather than to spread it further. When the old chaos erupted beneath Eliam Lois and threatened to consume the kingdom, Alsana stood with the Ivory King and his knights in defense of the realm she had come to love, fighting against forces that were in some sense her own kin. Her title, the Silent Oracle, speaks to her role as both prophet and keeper of secrets. She understands things about the abyss and the nature of darkness that even the most learned scholars can only guess at, possesses knowledge that could reshape entire philosophies of magic and humanity if it were widely shared. But she keeps much of this knowledge to herself, speaking only when silence would cause more harm than revelation, maintaining a reserve that is part wisdom and part self-protection. To share everything she knows would be to make herself vulnerable in ways she cannot afford, and it might also burden others with understanding they are not prepared to bear. Her dialogue, when encountered, is marked by melancholy and resignation, the tone of someone who has watched tragedy unfold and knows that more tragedy awaits. She speaks of the Ivory King with a mixture of reverence and sorrow, honoring his memory while acknowledging the terrible price he paid for his heroism. She describes the burden she bears, maintaining her vigil over the old chaos in the centuries since the king's sacrifice, holding back the tide of destruction through constant vigilance and the expenditure of power that leaves her perpetually exhausted. Yet there is also hope in her words, faint but genuine, a belief that perhaps the cycle can be broken, or at least interrupted, that the sacrifices made by the Ivory King and his knights were not entirely in vain. She sees in the player character's arrival the possibility of resolution, the chance to complete what the Ivory King began, and to finally end the threat that has hung over Eliam Lois since the old chaos first erupted from the depths. This hope is cautious and qualified, tempered by long experience with disappointment and loss, but it is nevertheless real, and it provides the motivation for her to offer what assistance she can. The Lois Knights represent the pinnacle of dedication and loyalty, warriors who followed their king into the very heart of destruction without hesitation or complaint. These were not conscripts or hired mercenaries fighting for pay or under compulsion, but rather volunteers who understood exactly what was being asked of them and chose to accept that burden anyway. When the Ivory King made the decision to enter the old chaos and attempt to seal it from within, when he called for warriors to accompany him on a mission that offered no hope of survival or return, these knights stepped forward, knowing that they were volunteering for their own destruction. The mission required them to enter the old chaos itself, to descend into realms of flame and corruption that were inimical to all life, and to fight their way to positions where they could help the king establish and maintain the seal he intended to create. This was not a brief expedition or a daring raid, but rather an eternal commitment, for the seal could only be maintained through the constant presence and sacrifice of those who had entered the chaos. The knights would not be returning to the surface world, would not be seeing their families or homes again, would not be enjoying the peace and prosperity that their sacrifice would help to secure. Yet they went anyway, because their king asked it of them, and because they understood that the alternative was the destruction of everything they had sworn to protect. This decision was not made in the heat of battle or under the pressure of immediate crisis, but rather after careful consideration of all alternatives, after exhausting every other option and concluding that only this ultimate sacrifice could provide even a chance of success. The knights had time to make their peace with their fate, to say whatever farewells they deemed necessary, to prepare themselves spiritually and emotionally for what awaited them. When they finally entered the old chaos, they did so with the same discipline and coordination they had displayed throughout their service to the Ivory King. They maintained their formations, supported one another through the descent, and took up the positions assigned to them with precision that spoke to countless hours of training and absolute trust in their commander. And then, in those positions, they began the work of maintaining the seal, pouring their very essence into the magical barriers that would keep the chaos contained, burning themselves away in service to a cause that would never be widely known or properly appreciated. The fact that their frozen forms can still be found throughout Elium Lois, scattered in locations that seem random, but which closer examination reveals to follow a pattern related to the geometry of the seal, speaks to the incomplete nature of their sacrifice. They entered the old chaos and helped establish the seal, but in the moment of its creation, something went wrong, or at least not entirely according to plan. Instead of being consumed entirely by the flames, the knights were instead ejected back into the kingdom they had left behind, their bodies preserved in ice that may be protective, or may simply be another form of prison. Rescuing these knights from their icy prisons requires careful exploration of Elium Lois and attention to environmental cues that suggest where they might be found. Each knight discovered and freed adds to the forces available for the final confrontation with the old chaos and the corrupted Ivory King, making what would otherwise be a nearly impossible battle merely extremely difficult. The minimum number required is 3, but 4 knights can be found for those willing to explore thoroughly, and each additional knight makes a significant difference in the battle's dynamics. The freed knights do not speak or show obvious signs of consciousness beyond their willingness to fight alongside those who freed them. They simply take up their positions when the time comes, ready to fulfill the same purpose they committed to centuries ago when they first followed their king into the depths. Their loyalty transcends death and time and corruption, remaining absolute even after everything else has been stripped away, and this loyalty provides the foundation upon which victory becomes possible. The old chaos itself represents a threat of a fundamentally different order than most of the dangers encountered throughout the Dark Souls series. This is not a powerful enemy or a dangerous environment, but rather something closer to a natural disaster, a force of nature that operates according to its own logic and cannot be reasoned with or appeased. The chaos is a wellspring of primal flame, a concentration of the power that drove the first flame and gave birth to the Age of Fire, but uncontrolled and uncontained, burning without purpose or direction, consuming everything within reach simply because consumption is its nature. The source of this chaos and the reasons for its eruption beneath Elium Lois remain somewhat mysterious, explained through fragmentary texts and environmental clues that suggest connections to other chaos-related phenomena throughout the series. Some evidence points to deliberate attempts to tap into or harness this power, experiments that went catastrophically wrong when the forces involved proved too powerful to control. Other clues suggest that the chaos was already present beneath the kingdom, a sleeping threat that was awakened by some combination of circumstance and misfortune. Regardless of its origin, the result was the same: a rupture in the foundations of Elium Lois, through which chaos flame poured with force sufficient to threaten not merely the kingdom but potentially the entire region and perhaps beyond. The flames that erupted were hot enough to melt stone and vaporize metal, and they carried within them a corrupting influence that transformed whatever they touched, warping matter and energy in ways that defied natural law. The Ivory King's response to this catastrophe demonstrated both his courage and his understanding of the fundamental truth that some threats cannot be defeated through conventional means. His decision to enter the chaos personally, rather than ordering his knights to go in his stead, speaks to his character and his philosophy of leadership. He could have remained above, directing the operation from safety while others risked everything, and such a choice would have been defensible and perhaps even wise from a purely practical standpoint. But the Ivory King understood that asking others to make sacrifices one is unwilling to make oneself is the mark of a tyrant rather than a true leader, and he could not demand that his knights give everything while he held anything back. The descent into the old chaos takes the form of an arena battle where the objective is not merely to survive, but to close several portals through which chaos flame and corrupted creatures pour into the chamber. The freed Lois Knights assist in this effort, each knight positioning themselves at one of the portals and working to seal it through a combination of combat prowess and what appears to be sacrificial magic. The process is not instantaneous, but rather requires time during which the knight is vulnerable and the portal continues to disgorge enemies, creating a desperate race against accumulating threats. The painted worlds of Ariandel and the kingdoms buried beneath ice and ash share more than simple geography or proximity in the larger mythology of Dark Souls. They are connected by fundamental themes that recur across all these stories, like musical motifs in a vast symphony, patterns that reveal themselves not through explicit statement, but through careful observation of how these tales mirror and echo one another. To understand the full significance of any single DLC is to understand how it relates to the others, how the same essential truths about decay and renewal, about holding on and letting go, about the prices paid for love and the costs of loyalty, manifest in different contexts and through different characters across the breadth of the Dark Souls universe. The cycle of rot and renewal that defines the painted world of Ariandel is perhaps the most explicit expression of a theme that runs through all these stories, but it is far from the only manifestation. In Ariandel, the conflict between fire and rot is made literal and central, with Sister Friede actively suppressing the flame that should cleanse the world and allow something new to be painted in its place. The inhabitants of the painting are divided between those who understand that rot has progressed too far to be reversed and that only fire can allow for rebirth, and those who have become so comfortable with decay that they cannot imagine any alternative and actively resist the transformation that would destroy what they know in service of creating something better. This same pattern appears in different guises throughout the other DLCs. The kingdoms that fell to the old chaos or were buried under snow refused to acknowledge the inevitability of change, attempted to preserve themselves in their current state rather than accepting transformation. The old Iron King's realm pursued expansion and industrial power without regard for sustainability, building structures and systems that could only be maintained through constantly increasing resource extraction, until the entire edifice became too unwieldy to support itself and collapsed under its own weight. Eliam Lois achieved a kind of perfection under the Ivory King's rule, and then froze itself, rather than risk that perfection being tarnished by the passage of time and the accumulation of small compromises and failures. Even the Ringed City participates in this pattern, though in a more subtle way. The illusion maintained by Filianor's slumber represented an attempt to preserve a moment that had already passed, to hold back the truth of the world's decay through sheer force of will and divine power. The inhabitants of the city lived within this preserved moment, experiencing a reality that had already been destroyed, but which continued to exist for them as long as they did not look too closely at the cracks in the facade. When the illusion finally shattered, when Filianor woke and could no longer maintain the dream, the truth revealed itself with a totality that was almost merciful in its completeness. The theme of holding on versus letting go is intimately connected to this cycle of rot and renewal, but it carries its own distinct emotional weight. Sister Friede and Father Ariandel chose to hold on to their rotting world rather than allow it to burn, and this choice condemned the painted realm to a slow deterioration that served no one's interests, except perhaps their own desire to avoid confronting the changes that fire would bring. Their love for the world they knew, their attachment to familiar decay over uncertain transformation, blinded them to the suffering their choice caused for those inhabitants who understood what was needed, but lacked the power to implement it. This same pattern of destructive attachment appears in Nadalia's relationship with the old Iron King, or rather her relationship with his memory and legacy. She arrived at Broom Tower, too late to be what she was meant to be, too late to serve the purpose for which her fragment of Manus had been created, or discovered its intended role. Rather than accepting this failure and moving on, rather than finding some new purpose or simply fading away, she clung to the remnants of what might have been, fragmenting herself further across the tower's many idols, spreading her essence so thin that she could never again be whole, but at least could maintain some presence in a place that had been prepared for someone like her, even if that someone had never properly arrived. Fume Knight Raim's story contains perhaps the clearest expression of the costs of holding on to bitterness and resentment. His exile from the old Iron King's service was unjust, or at least he believed it to be unjust, and that belief shaped everything that followed. He could have found new purpose elsewhere, could have built a life that was not defined entirely by opposition to his former comrades and rejection of his former ideals. Instead, he nursed his grievances until they consumed him, allowed his anger to transform him into something dark and terrible, and ultimately became a guardian of corruption and decay, in service to a fragmented being who could never properly appreciate or reciprocate his devotion. Yet the alternative to holding on is not always clearly superior or obviously correct. The Ivory King let go in the most complete and final way possible, surrendering everything including his own life and soul in a gambit to save his kingdom from the old chaos. His sacrifice was magnificent and terrible in equal measure, a demonstration of selflessness so absolute that it approaches the religious in its implications. But the long-term results of this sacrifice are ambiguous at best. For Ilium Lois still stands frozen and empty. The chaos still burns beneath the surface, and the king himself was corrupted by the very forces he sought to contain, transformed into a threat that required his own loyal subjects to eventually strike him down. The fragmentation of Manus represents another recurring theme, one that speaks to the divisible and persistent nature of darkness and corruption. After his defeat in Ulasail, the Father of the Abyss did not simply cease to exist or return to whatever void had spawned him. Instead, his essence scattered, breaking into at least 4 distinct fragments that each developed their own identity and purpose while retaining connection to the original whole. These fragments are Elana, Nadalia, Alsana, and one other whose identity remains deliberately obscured in the available texts, each representing different aspects of what Manus was or might have been. Elana, the squalid queen, embodies fury and degradation, the aspects of the abyss that manifest as active destruction and corruption. She rules over the ruins of Shulva with power drawn from her connection to primal darkness, summoning defenders and hurling magic with an intensity that speaks to rage barely contained beneath surface civility. Her relationship with the Sunken King and her role as Sin's protector suggests that she is capable of dedication and perhaps even love, but these softer emotions are filtered through and shaped by the fundamental anger that defines her existence. Nadalia represents longing and incompleteness, the tragedy of arriving too late to fulfill one's purpose, and the desperate attempt to find meaning in a role that was never properly occupied. Her fragmentation across the Ashen Idols speaks to a psyche that has been shattered by disappointment and loss, spread so thin in the attempt to maintain some presence and relevance that true coherence becomes impossible. She is perhaps the most purely tragic of the fragments, defined entirely by absence and unfulfilled potential. Alsana demonstrates that the fragments were not locked into predetermined roles or inevitable corruption, that choice and environment could shape them into something different from what they had been. Her love for the Ivory King transformed her from a potential source of destruction into a protector, and eventually into someone capable of genuine sacrifice in service of others. This transformation did not erase her connection to the Abyss or eliminate the darkness she carried within her, but it redirected those forces toward constructive rather than destructive ends, proving that even fragments of primordial evil can find redemption through love and dedication. The fourth fragment's identity remains a subject of speculation and debate among those who study such matters. Some evidence suggests connections to the painted world of Ariandel, or to figures encountered in the base game of Dark Souls 3, while other clues point in different directions entirely. This ambiguity may be deliberate, an acknowledgement that not all mysteries require or benefit from explicit resolution, that some questions are more interesting when left open to interpretation. What unites all the fragments, regardless of their individual characteristics, is their demonstration that humanity's darkness is both powerful and persistent, that it cannot be eliminated through simple violence or sealed away permanently through even the strongest magic. The abyss exists as long as humanity exists, woven into the very fabric of what it means to be human, and attempts to excise it completely are doomed to failure because they are attempts to remove something essential rather than merely problematic. The fragments show that this darkness can be directed, shaped, even partially redeemed, but never fully eliminated without eliminating humanity itself. The theme of loyalty beyond death runs through nearly every story told in the DLCs, manifesting in forms that range from the beautiful to the horrific. Slave Knight Gale's quest to gather the Dark Soul spans eons and transforms him from a lowly warrior into a figure of such power that he becomes the final challenge at the world's end. His motivation throughout this impossibly long journey is not personal ambition or desire for power, but rather devotion to the painter and her need for dark pigment to create a new world. Even when the accumulation of Dark Souls drives him to madness and transforms him into a barely coherent monster, even when his conscious mind has been subsumed by the weight of humanity's accumulated darkness, some core part of him continues to pursue the mission he accepted so long ago. The great grey wolf Sif maintains vigil over Artorias' grave for centuries after the night's fall, refusing to abandon the post or the memory of the one who saved him in the depths of the abyss. The alternate encounter with Sif, available only to those who first rescue the wolf pup in the past, adds layers of tragedy to this devotion, for it reveals that Sif recognizes the player character and understands that this person was a friend to both himself and to Artorias. Yet even this recognition cannot override the loyalty to his fallen master's memory, and Sif must still fight to prevent anyone from following Artorias' path into the abyss. Sir Wilhelm's absolute devotion to Sister Friede drives him to stand guard over the approach to the painted world, threatening and attacking anyone who might disturb her or challenge her rule. His loyalty persists despite or perhaps because of Friede's decision to renounce her former life and her sister's, to abandon the Sable Church and the philosophy it represented. Wilhelm followed her into exile and continues to serve her in this strange painted realm, his dedication unchanged by the profound transformations in her life and purpose. The Lois Knights represent perhaps the purest expression of loyalty beyond reasonable limits. Warriors who followed their king into the old chaos, knowing that they would never return, that their sacrifice would be permanent and total. Their devotion did not waver, even when confronted with the reality of what was being asked of them, even when given time to fully consider the magnitude of their commitment. They went into the flames because their king led them there, and centuries later, when freed from their icy prisons, they take up the same mission without hesitation or question. Yet this theme of loyalty is not presented as unambiguously positive or admirable. The consequences of such absolute devotion are often terrible, both for those who give it and for those around them. Gale's loyalty to the painter results in his transformation into a monster and his death at the end of everything. Sif's loyalty to Artorius' memory means the wolf must fight and potentially die defending a grave that the one buried there would not have wanted protected at such cost. The Loist Knight's loyalty accomplishes its immediate goal of sealing the old chaos, but leaves them trapped in an eternal half-life, frozen in the moment of their sacrifice, unable to move forward or find peace. The painted worlds serve as more than mere settings or interesting locations to explore. They function as metaphors for escapism and the human need for places of refuge, where one can flee from the harshness of reality. The original painted world of Ariamis was created as a sanctuary for those who were too dangerous, too strange, or too broken to exist in the outside world. It offered them not freedom in the conventional sense, but rather a place where they could exist without being hunted or persecuted, where their differences were the norm rather than aberrations requiring correction. Ariandel continues this tradition while adding new layers of complexity to the concept. It is still a refuge for the forlorn, still a place where those who have nowhere else to go can find something approximating home. But it is also a prison for those inhabitants who understand that the world needs to burn but lack the power to ignite it themselves. The same qualities that make it a sanctuary also make it a trap. And the line between protection and imprisonment becomes increasingly difficult to discern. The need for fire to cleanse painted worlds and allow for their renewal speaks to the broader cycle of destruction and creation that defines the Dark Souls universe. Stasis inevitably leads to rot. Preservation without change becomes corruption, and the refusal to accept necessary endings results in slow degradation that serves no one. The flame that burns the painted world away is not an enemy or a threat, but rather a necessary part of the cycle, the force that clears away what has become too corrupt to save and make space for something new to emerge. The role of artists in this cycle adds another dimension to the metaphor. The painter creates worlds from dark pigment and blood, giving form to new realities that will eventually also fall to rot and require their own cleansing fire. This endless cycle of creation, decay, and destruction mirrors the larger patterns that govern the Age of Fire and the inevitable transition to whatever comes after. The artist's role is not to create permanent solutions or eternal paradises, but rather to ensure that when one world ends, another can begin, that the cycle continues even if individual iterations must eventually fail. The connection between the Dark Soul's blood and the pigment required for painting suggests that creation requires sacrifice, that bringing new worlds into being cannot be accomplished through pure inspiration or abstract vision, but demands something tangible and costly. Gale's quest to gather the Dark Soul across eons, his willingness to become a monster in service of providing the painter with her pigment, represents the extreme end of this principle, but it applies in less dramatic forms throughout the series. The Ringed City's revelation about the nature of reality and illusion at Time's End provides a capstone to many of the themes explored throughout the DLCs. The discovery that the magnificent city was already destroyed, that everything experienced there was maintained only through Filianor's sleeping illusion, forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the relationship between perception and reality. If a place exists in the experience of those who inhabit it, does it matter whether that experience corresponds to some objective external truth? Is a beautiful illusion preferable to an ugly reality? These questions have no comfortable answers, and the DLC wisely does not attempt to provide definitive resolutions. The desert of ash that represents reality once the illusion falls away is simultaneously liberating and horrifying. It is the truth, unvarnished and absolute, the genuine state of the world at time's end, after all the lies and protective fictions have been stripped away. But it is also barren and empty, offering nothing but desolation and the opportunity to fight one final battle at the end of everything. Whether this truth is preferable to the beautiful lie that preceded it depends entirely on what one values more: the comfort of pleasant illusion or the harsh clarity of genuine understanding. Gale's presence in this desert, his transformation into the final challenge that must be overcome, ties together many of the threads that run through all the DLCs. He is a being who has sacrificed everything in service of a cause he believes in, whose loyalty has transcended time and sanity and transformation into something monstrous. He has achieved his goal of gathering the dark soul, but has been consumed by it in the process, becoming simultaneously the guardian of what he sought and the obstacle preventing its delivery to the one who needs it. Fighting him at the end of everything, in a place where reality has finally admitted its own exhaustion and decay, feels less like confronting an enemy and more like participating in some form of assisted suicide, helping to complete a mission that the one who began it can no longer finish on his own. The delivery of the Dark Soul's blood to the painter after Gale's defeat represents hope of a very specific and limited kind. It is not the grand hope of saving the world or restoring some lost golden age, not the promise that everything will be made right or that suffering will be retroactively justified. Instead, it is simply the hope that when everything ends, as everything must eventually end, there is the possibility of something new beginning. The painter takes the dark pigment she has waited so long to receive and prepares to create another world, one that will also eventually rot and require its own fire, but which for a time will offer sanctuary to new generations of the forlorn and unwanted. This cycle of creation, decay, and renewal is presented not as a tragedy to be lamented or a problem requiring solution, but rather as simply the nature of existence itself. Worlds are born, they flourish, they decay, and they die, making space for new worlds to be born in their turn. The fire that cleanses is both destroyer and liberator, ending what has become corrupt while creating the conditions for fresh growth. The dark pigment that allows new creation is gathered through sacrifice and suffering, but without it, no new worlds could come into being. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the forgotten corners and buried kingdoms of the Dark Souls universe. Having walked together through painted worlds and frozen citadels, through memories preserved in amber and futures that have already become past, these stories, taken together, form a tapestry of such complexity and emotional depth that no single viewing can capture all their nuances, no brief telling can encompass all their implications. Yet certain truths emerge from the pattern they create, themes that recur with such consistency that they seem to represent not merely artistic choices, but fundamental observations about the nature of existence itself. The painted worlds of Ariandel and the realms that preceded them demonstrate that refuge and prison are often two names for the same place, that the sanctuary which shelters can also constrain, and that the line between protection and captivity exists more in intention than in physical form. Those who flee to such places seeking escape from the harsh judgments and impossible demands of the outside world find both the peace they sought and a new set of limitations they did not anticipate. They are safe from external persecution, but trapped within boundaries that cannot be crossed without surrendering the very safety that made the refuge attractive in the first place. Sister Frida's choice to suppress the flame and embrace rot rather than accepting the cleansing fire speaks to a very human fear of change and transformation, the terror of letting go of what is known, even when that known thing has become corrupt and harmful. Her painted world offered her a place where she could be what others needed her to be, where her past could be left behind, and her identity reconstructed according to new parameters. The prospect of allowing that world to burn, of facing once again the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next, proved more frightening than continuing to rule over ever-deepening decay. The kingdoms buried beneath ice and ash, swallowed by chaos or preserved in frozen perfection. Each tell variations on the same essential story of civilizations that reached too far or held too tight, that pursued power without wisdom, or preservation without change. The old Iron King built his tower as monument to human ingenuity and industrial might, creating systems of such scale and complexity that their maintenance became an end in itself, consuming more resources than they produced, and eventually collapsing under their own weight. Eliam Lois achieved something approaching perfection under the Ivory King's rule, and then chose to freeze that moment rather than risk the compromises and failures that continued existence would inevitably bring. The Ringed City showed us the ultimate conclusion of all these patterns, the final truth waiting at the end of time, when all illusions have been exhausted and all lies exposed. The magnificent city that seemed so solid and eternal was revealed to be nothing more than a dream maintained through desperate effort, a shared hallucination that allowed its inhabitants to continue existing in a world that had already moved past them. When Filianor woke and could no longer sustain the illusion, when the true state of reality finally became undeniable, what remained was only ash, and the opportunity to face that truth with whatever dignity and courage could be mustered. Yet even in this bleakest of revelations, even standing in the desert at the end of everything, meaning persists in the form of Slave Knight Gale and his impossible quest. This warrior who began as nothing, as cannon fodder deemed unworthy of even basic recognition, transformed himself through sheer dedication into the most significant figure at the end of time. His loyalty to the painter never wavered across the eons of his search, never faltered even when the dark souls he consumed drove him to madness and transformed him into something that barely retained any trace of what he had been. The tragedy of Gael's story is not that he failed, but rather that he succeeded too well, accomplishing his mission, but being consumed by it in the process, gathering the dark soul he sought, but being unable to deliver it, because the very act of gathering had transformed him into something that could not stop fighting, even when fighting no longer served any purpose. His presence at the end of everything, his transformation into the final obstacle standing between the player and completion of the mission he himself initiated, represents a kind of cosmic irony that is somehow also deeply moving. He achieved what he set out to achieve, but the cost of that achievement was everything, including the ability to appreciate or properly complete it. The great grey wolf, Sif's vigil over Artorias' grave, speaks to the persistence of love and loyalty beyond all reasonable boundaries, the refusal to abandon those we care about, even when they are beyond any help we could offer, and our devotion serves no practical purpose. The wolf waited centuries for a master who would never return, defending a grave that the one buried there would not have wanted protected at such cost, and the alternative encounter available to those who rescued Sif in the past adds layers of recognition and sorrow to this already tragic devotion. The wolf knows you, remembers you, understands that you were a friend, yet must still fight because loyalty to Artorias' memory transcends even friendship and gratitude. The Lois Knights followed their king into the old chaos, knowing they would never return, accepting complete destruction in service of a cause they believed worth that ultimate price. And centuries later, when freed from their icy prisons, they take up the same mission without hesitation. Their loyalty accomplished its immediate goal of sealing the chaos, but it also trapped them in eternal half-life, frozen in the moment of their sacrifice, unable to progress toward either true death or renewed life. Whether this outcome justifies their devotion or merely demonstrates its terrible cost remains an open question that admits no comfortable answer. The fragmentation of Manus into multiple beings, each carrying aspects of the original darkness while developing unique characteristics and purposes, demonstrates that evil and corruption are not monolithic forces, but rather complex phenomena that can manifest in countless forms and serve diverse purposes. Elana's fury, Nadalia's longing, and Alsana's capacity for love and redemption all derive from the same source. All contain the same essential darkness, yet they express that darkness in such different ways that they appear to be entirely separate entities with no connection beyond their shared origin. This fragmentation speaks to the persistent and adaptable nature of the abyss, its ability to survive, defeat, and emerge in new forms that may be more or less dangerous than the original, but which remain fundamentally connected to humanity's shadow. The lesson here is not that darkness can be destroyed, but rather that it must be constantly managed, redirected, channeled toward purposes that are productive rather than purely destructive. Alsana's transformation through her love for the Ivory King proves that even fragments of primordial evil can find something approximating redemption, that choice and circumstance can shape even the darkest natures toward light. The artists who create painted worlds from dark pigment and blood represent the creative impulse that persists even in the face of inevitable decay, the drive to build and make and bring new things into being despite the certainty that everything created will eventually rot and require destruction to make way for the next generation. The painter who waits at the end of Ariandel for the dark soul's blood is not naive about the nature of what she will create, does not imagine that her world will somehow escape the fate of all previous painted worlds. She knows that what she makes will eventually decay, that it will provide sanctuary for a time, but will ultimately require the same cleansing fire that destroyed Ariandel. Yet she prepares to create anyway, because the alternative is to allow the cycle to end, to permit the last painted world to rot into nothing without replacement, leaving the forlorn and unwanted with nowhere to go and no refuge to shelter them. Her acceptance of impermanence, her willingness to create knowing that creation is temporary, represents a kind of courage that is quiet but profound. It is easier to create when one believes that what is made will last forever than to build with full knowledge that everything is temporary and that the best one can hope for is that the temporary will be beautiful and meaningful while it persists. Gale's delivery of the Dark Soul's blood, accomplished only through his defeat at the player's hands, completes a mission that began so long ago that its origins have been lost to time. His transformation from hollow slave to the being who carries within him the accumulated darkness of humanity across the ages represents a journey of such scope that it dwarfs most of the legendary quests and epic adventures that fill the Prulit world's mythologies. That he completed this journey not for personal glory or reward, but purely in service to another, purely to provide the painter with what she needed to create her new world, elevates his story from merely impressive to genuinely transcendent. The crown of the Sunken King, retrieved from the depths of Shulva after defeating Elana and potentially confronting Sin himself, represents the acknowledgement and remembrance of a kingdom that has been all but forgotten by the wider world. This crown is not a tool of power or a weapon to be wielded, but rather a symbol, a physical reminder that this place and its people once existed, and that their struggles and sacrifices had meaning, even if that meaning is now recognized only by those few who descend into the depths to discover their story. The crown of the old Iron King carries similar weight, recovered from Broom Tower after confronting the darkness that consumed that industrial kingdom. Its presence in the player's inventory serves as monument to ambition unchecked by wisdom, to the dangers of pursuing growth and expansion without regard for sustainability or long-term consequences. The old Iron King built his tower and his industrial empire on foundations that could not support the weight he placed upon them, and his crown is all that remains to mark his passing and the fall of everything he constructed. The crown of the Ivory King, claimed after descending into the old chaos and defeating the corrupted form of the monarch who sacrificed everything to protect his kingdom, may be the most poignant of all. This king was, by all accounts, as close to perfect as mortal rulers ever achieve, wise and just and genuinely devoted to his people's welfare. His sacrifice was made from the purest motives and with full understanding of what it would cost him. Yet even this perfect king was ultimately corrupted by the very forces he sought to contain, transformed into a threat that required his own loyal subjects to destroy him. His crown serves as reminder that even the best intentions and most heroic sacrifices can have tragic outcomes, that sometimes doing everything right still results in defeat. Together, these crowns represent the accumulated weight of fallen kingdoms and forgotten kings, the countless attempts across the ages to build something lasting and meaningful, to create order out of chaos, and light out of darkness. Each crown marks a failure, but they are magnificent failures, the kind that occur when beings of courage and vision strive for goals that transcend their individual limitations. That these kingdoms fell does not negate the value of the attempt or render meaningless the sacrifices made in their service. The fire fades, as fire must always eventually fade. But before it goes dark entirely, it illuminates truths worth carrying forward into whatever comes next. The lesson of the Painted Worlds is that refuge must eventually be abandoned or transformed, that stasis inevitably becomes corruption, and that the courage to let go is often more difficult and more necessary than the courage to hold on. The lesson of the buried kingdoms is that power without wisdom leads to catastrophe, that preservation without change becomes imprisonment, and that even the greatest achievements are temporary and must eventually give way to what follows. The lesson of the fragmented abyss is that darkness is not monolithic or unchangeable, that even the most corrupt and dangerous forces can be redirected toward constructive purposes, given the right circumstances and choices. The lesson of eternal loyalty is double-edged, showing both the beauty of devotion that transcends all boundaries and the terrible costs such devotion exacts from those who give it and those who receive it. Rest now, Ashen One, for your journey through these forgotten kingdoms is complete. You have walked through painted worlds and frozen citadels, through memories preserved across ages and futures that have already become past. You have witnessed the fall of kingdoms and the persistence of loyalty, the corruption of heroes and the redemption of fragments of evil. You have carried crowns claimed from the depths of ruined realms, and you have delivered dark pigment that will allow new worlds to be painted when the old ones have burned away. The painter sits with her canvas, ready to create something new when the time comes, when the current painted world has finally rotted beyond saving, and the flame has done its necessary work of cleansing. Gale's mission is complete. Despite his transformation, his loyalty vindicated, even though it cost him everything. Sif rests at last beside Artorius' grave, his vigil finally ended. The Lois Knights stand with their king, their sacrifice acknowledged even if it cannot be undone. The Ivory King's crown has been reunited with its companions, and the stories of these fallen kingdoms have been told once more so that they might be remembered. Let these tales of dark fantasy carry you now into peaceful sleep, into dreams that are gentle despite the darkness of the stories that inspired them. There is comfort in the knowledge that even in worlds as bleak as these, loyalty persists and love endures, that sacrifice has meaning, even when it does not achieve the desired outcome, that the struggle to create and protect and build continues, even in the face of certain eventual failure. The fire fades, and with it, consciousness drifts into the gentle dark where all things rest before beginning again. Sleep now, traveler, for tomorrow there will be new painted worlds to explore, new kingdoms to discover, new stories of sacrifice and loyalty, and the eternal dance between light and shadow. But tonight, let these stories be enough. Let their weight settle over you like a blanket, and let the darkness embrace you as it embraces all things in the end. Your journey is complete, your vigil is ended, and you have earned the right to rest in peace, until the next flame kindles and calls you forth once more.